A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support. AITA for leaving the room after my BF surprised me. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. Brad had been working tirelessly for months, and I thought he finally wanted to treat us to some much-needed relaxation at his family's cabin in the woods, just the two of us. I should have felt lucky, but as the sun dipped below the horizon on our first night, I sensed something was off. After a lovely dinner, Brad insisted we take a stroll outside to gaze at the stars, a romantic gesture, I thought, but when we reached the clearing, he pulled out a flashlight and shone it onto a crudely carved face on a tree. "Isn't that creepy?" He laughed, but I just felt a chill run down my spine. It looked like a distorted version of a human face, its mouth stretched wide in an unnatural grin. I jokingly told him it reminded me of a horror movie, but Brad's laughter faded into something more serious as he pointed out the countless other carvings littering the trees around us, each one more sinister than the last. It felt like we had stumbled into the hideout of a deranged artist. I suggested we head back, my instincts screaming at me that this was not just a scenic getaway but perhaps something else entirely, yet he insisted on taking a closer look, thrill-seeking gleaming in his eyes as he veered deeper into the woods, and I followed reluctantly, the growing darkness around us feeling more oppressive with each step. That's when I stumbled upon an old makeshift altar tucked away behind the trees, adorned with a grotesque collection of animal bones and what looked like dried flowers, and I froze, dread coiling in my stomach as a realization dawned upon me that this wasn't just an innocent surprise. Brad's sense of adventure had led us into something dark and ancient, perhaps a ritual of some sort that beckoned us into its fold. When I nervously voiced my unease, Brad just chuckled and insisted it was all just part of the fun. In his mind, it was another wacky challenge to conquer. That night was a canvas waiting for our adventures to color it, but I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching us, a presence that made my skin crawl, and when I looked back to him, I no longer recognized my boyfriend. The glint in his eyes was wild, as if the forest itself had wrapped him in its cruel grasp. I turned to leave, my heart pounding, but he laughed again, telling me I was being dramatic, and pulled my arm, the grip tightening until I yanked away, the laughter fading to an intensity that made my blood run cold. It hit me then that the woods weren't just alive, but they had a heartbeat and it wasn't friendly. "This isn't funny, Brad." I almost screamed as panic bubbled in my chest, but he could barely contain himself, entwining a lock of my hair around his fingers, looking past me as if I were an obstacle blocking him from the greater thrill lurking in the shadows. The air thickened, charged with a tension I couldn't shake and screaming at me to run, but for some reason, I didn't. I felt like I was watching my own life play out in front of me, a puppet on strings I couldn't control. Brad leaned in, whispering something I could no longer hear, his breath brushing against my neck in a way that sent electric shivers down my spine, and then it happened. Behind him, from the darkness, emerged something human-shaped, its limbs crooked and elongated, lurking with a predatory stillness as if it were mimicking the worst parts of humanity. Its gaze locked onto me, pinning me in place, and I fought with every fiber of my being not to scream. It was a body, I realized, a sick parody of a human form, its skin taut and pale as if stretched over too many bones, and I could almost see it smile, formed not from joy but something more sinister, something avid and hungry. I stumbled backward, my survival instincts kicking in, and without a second thought, I bolted back toward the cabin, half glancing over my shoulder to witness the horror unfold as Brad turned, his look of excitement morphing into confusion, then anger as he called out after me, a distorted echo against the trees. I flung myself into the cabin, slamming the door shut, my heart pounding in rhythm from my panic as I frantically locked it, breathing heavy as I sank to the floor, the oppressive quiet of the retreating woods wrapping around me. But it didn't take long before I could hear him pounding on the door, his voice shifting to an angry holler as he demanded I let him in, that I was overreacting, that it was all just part of the surprise. I wanted to scream back, to explain that something had changed in him, that whatever he had become was a stranger, but the dread pulled deeper, shoving all logic aside as I crouched between the couch and a coffee table, praying the darkness would hold me tight. The house felt like a coffin, the night seeped through the walls, mocking my isolation as I reached for my phone, just wanting to call someone, anyone, but when I turned it on, it was dead, an unexpected betrayal that froze the blood in my veins. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear, and the silence that loomed outside felt thicker, a presence lingering just out of sight, and when I finally mustered the courage to peer through the window, my breath caught in my throat. Brad stood looking towards me, uncharacteristically still, shadowed by the trees, but in that moment, the woods seemed to breathe with him, the upside-down grin plastered on his face wider than before. I realized then that whatever he had confronted out there, whatever darkness he had engaged with, had seeped into his very essence, reshaping him into something unrecognizable, and all at once, fear surged. He would come back to the door, but it wouldn't be Brad. I felt it deep in my bones that I had wandered into something that wouldn't allow me to leave easily. My heart raced as shadows danced behind him, flashes of twisted figures lurking in the moonlight, and time seemed to lose sense as the night wore on, every call and pound on the door drowning in an abyss that threatened to devour me whole, and I knew then that the hardest choice lay before me, to wait in agonizing uncertainty or to escape while I still could, but the truth gnawed at me. The person I fell in love with might already be gone, replaced by a reflection of an ancient ritual's hunger, festering beneath the guise I once trusted. Ultimately, I did the only thing I could. I grabbed my bag and slipped out through the back, terrified but driven by the primal instinct to survive, running into the woods with my heart racing, the weight of the foreboding night chasing me as I looked back just once, only to see Brad, the distorted figure in the darkness, staring back, the woods swelling around him, wrapping him in their embrace, and in that haunting moment, I knew I wasn't just running from him, I was escaping an entity that had taken his place, a dark truth that clung to me like an omen, whispering that if I ever looked back, I might join him, too. I am writing this because if I don't, the memory will consume me. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and for almost half my life, I've harbored a secret that has haunted me since childhood, a secret that recently spilled out and shattered my younger brother's perception of his most cherished memory. 14 years ago, we spent an idyllic summer at our family's lake cabin, where the highlight was a photo of my 6-year-old brother, Daniel, catching his first fish. In that moment, he beamed with an ear-to-ear grin, the sun reflecting off the lake's surface, framing him in what seemed like pure magic. But the truth? That photo was a lie. I'd photoshopped the image to replace a snapshot of him in tears, furious at not being able to haul in the fish I'd caught earlier. I did it to preserve not just his childhood pride but my own. I wanted to be the perfect big sister, the one who always made things better. For years, I let him believe he was a fishing prodigy, a glorious little angler destined for greatness, and I felt like I was doing right by him. However, guilt festered in me, a festering wound pretending to be a scar, and as life would have it, I plotted my confession, trying to plan it in the least destructive way. Yet, the worst time came a few nights ago when Daniel, now a confident 20-year-old with dreams of being a marine biologist, wanted to use that photograph for a presentation on childhood memories. That's when the truth slipped from my mouth like a dark shadow breaking free, the realization that my brother's most treasured moment was nothing more than a fabrication. I watched the joy in his eyes fade until they were eclipsed by confusion and betrayal. I initially thought admitting it meant I'd cleanse my conscience, but it only unleashed a raging storm in him, a tempest of hurt and anger that left him reeling. I thought he'd laugh it off, surely he wouldn't hold it against me. But as I witnessed disbelief morphing slowly into hurt, it dawned on me that I had stripped him of a part of his innocence, weaponized what was supposed to be a simple memory, turning it into a cruel joke that twisted his childhood in ways I never anticipated. "Why would you do that?" he demanded, his voice barely cracking but laced with a boiling fury that felt alien yet terrifyingly real. "It was my moment. You took that from me, and for what? A stupid story?" The pain in his voice cut deeper than any blade, and I crumbled. I never expected to feel this insignificance take root in me, as if I had turned back time and was faced with an immense weight of responsibility. I tried to explain my motives, how I thought I was protecting him, yet my words felt hollow against the backdrop of his devastated expression. That night, he walked out, leaving me alone in that cabin, its walls suddenly closing in on me, each of our shared memories mocking me with their cheerful nostalgia while I was engulfed in darkness. I spent the following hours replays in my mind. What if I'd told him earlier? What if I'd let him have those painful moments? I kept him safe, but I kept him small, shrunk him into this tiny box of falsehoods, and now he wouldn't speak to me. I tossed and turned until dawn, visions of my brother's face swirling, the hurt, confusion, and disgust straining and pulling within me. As I watched the first light of morning creep through the curtains, I made a decision. I needed to do more than just apologize. I needed to show him the truth behind the photo, the real memories, the harshness of life that accompanied growing up. That's when I turned to the internet, diving into every forum, every advice column I could find on how to mend the rifts in family dynamics, how to deal with guilt when it's intertwined with love. It was then that I stumbled onto something strange, a post titled "Twisted Memories, What Would You Do?" The comments flooded my vision, ranging from empathy to outright hostility. It was as if the world had taken their collective traumas and laid them bare for the sake of my enlightenment. Each tale was unique yet framed by a common theme, the struggle of truth versus illusion. Among them, a single comment stood out, a user claiming to have once erased a sibling's memory too. She wrote of a photograph that had twisted a sibling's childhood with dark magic. At first, it seemed absurd, but the more I read, the more I felt a chill creeping down my spine. The user shared that after years of sharing fabricated stories, the guilt manifested as something more sinister. She claimed that reality had worked around her lie, that she began to see glimpses of future memories that became nightmares, shadows that crawled into existence, feeding off the deception. As I read the comment, my heart started to race. I didn't want to spiral, but how could I ignore the uncanny parallels to my life? I decided that if Daniel wouldn't come back to me, I needed to find my own path through the chaos of guilt. I returned to the cabin, armed with the intent to face this truth head-on, and there I felt the weight of those walls close in on me once again, my own memories whispering doubts and fears. I pulled out my phone, wanting to salvage what remained of our bond, and scrolled through old pictures, each swipe sending jolts of nostalgia through me, reminding me of the little boy who had looked up to me for everything. When I stumbled upon the photo in question, there it was, the fake image that haunts me now, the one that ripped away Daniel's childhood dream like a thief in the night. But instead of just darkness, a flicker of something else caught my attention. In one corner of the picture, hidden in the shadows, a figure stood barely visible, unusually distorted, as if it were a reflection of something highly malevolent, its fingers stretched, reaching toward Daniel, the fish eerily vibrant yet dead in his innocent grasp. My heart raced. The comment I had dismissed now felt like a warning. I was about to delete the image, when the memory of that summer clamped down harder than ever. The shadows of our childhood somehow now felt as if they'd been alive all along. The fish, once a token of triumph, now felt like a whisper of something sinister, a memory turned into a potential nightmare, a cycle I had started. Suddenly, the cabin ambience shifted, it felt oppressive, and the air thickened with unshakable dread as I glanced towards the window where a chill breeze swept through, chilling the hair on my arms. There, lurking in the shadows where I'd once seen joy, I perceived movement, just a flicker, but enough to send a cold tremor up my spine. I raced outside, desperate to make sense of what I cropped out all those years ago, hoping to recover the essence of that moment and shield my brother from the darkness that might have crept within our lives through my deceit. What if, in the echoes of my defense, I had unleashed something more sinister, something festering all those years, waiting for the right moment to strike? I took a deep breath as I faced the lake, where sunlight danced innocently across the surface, but the memory of that photo lingered like a stain. I vowed to Daniel that I would rectify this mistake. It wouldn't matter how awful the truth was, it needed to be told. As I plunged into the water, each stroke burned with purpose, with the resolve to collect remnants of the past, to confront whatever shadows had twisted our truth. It took 2 agonizing hours, the sun slipping down the horizon by the time I emerged victorious. I held a rusted fishing lure in my grasp, the very one I recalled tossing in frustration during that summer. As everything fell into place in my mind, I felt a chill run through me, not at the lure but at how dark and twisted my path had become. When I finally returned to shore, I felt different, lighter, yet the shadows lingered, as if darkness intertwined with my essence. As I faced the cabin, knowing I had to confront Daniel, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The shadows seemed to stir, almost mocking me. But I made my way back to the cabin, with each step weighted by that rusty lure, hoping with every part of me to reconcile this burden of childhood illusions before it engulfed us both. And there I found him on the porch, lost in thought, vulnerable, shattered, and staring aimlessly at the fading light. "Daniel," I started, but the tremble in my voice echoed doubts that swirled in the still air. Would my truth be enough? Would it even matter? I hugged the lure to my chest, and as darkness fell around us, I took another step, knowing I still had my own damning shadows to face, a tale woven together by our secrets. I never thought refusing to give candy to my neighbor's kids could spiral into something so terrifying, but that's how the nightmare began. It started innocently enough. It was Halloween, and like every year, I had stocked up on the usual assortment of sweets, but this time, I was adamant about not giving any to the children who lived next door. You see, that family had moved in just a few months prior, and their kids, 2 boys named Jake and Sam, were anything but normal. Sure, at first glance, they seemed like regular kids, dressed up as superheroes and goblins just like everyone else, but there was always something off about their laughter. It echoed too loudly, cutting through the comforting air of the evening like a serrated knife, and their smiles stretched a little too wide, revealing too much of their teeth. When they came to my door that evening, I felt the dread knotting in my stomach as I looked down at their expectant faces, makeup smeared and gleaming like freshly spilled blood under the streetlight. I simply shook my head, muttered a polite sorry, and closed the door quickly, heart racing because as soon as I did, they stepped back and their expressions morphed from disappointment to something almost predatory. I pressed my ear against the door, expecting them to turn away, but instead, I could hear whispers, words I couldn't quite make out, conversations swaying and twisting in the air until it felt like even the walls were sharpening their ears, and then, with a slight click, I saw the doorknob turn, my heart dropping into my stomach. I rushed to check the locks, my breath hitching, and when I glanced back at the door, their faces were close against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking, pupils dilated like black holes ready to swallow me whole. I felt a chill run down my spine, something wasn't right. Later that night, I locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight, hoping to drown out the relentlessness of their sadistic giggles echoing through the dark. At midnight, I heard a sudden thud against the side of the house, my heart leapt, panic clawing at my throat, and I peeked out from the window. They stood there, cloaked in shadows, still wearing their costumes, but something else flickered in their eyes, a mischief so sinister it sent tremors sparking through my veins. I decided to call the police, dialing with shaking fingers, and as I whispered my fears into the phone, the operator's voice faded into a distant stream of incoherence while I watched through the blinds as the children began to move away, stage whispering to each other, as if plotting something insidious, their brazen confidence fueling a dark weight of inevitability in my stomach. I hung up the phone, listening for sirens that never came while I recalled every warning my mother had given me about children who looked too perfect, acting too strange, those warnings blurring with the image of their wide, gleaming smiles piercing through the night air. As the hours edged closer to dawn, the atmosphere thickened, like fog curling around my ankles, whispers suddenly morphing into faint, high-pitched giggles that echoed through the silence of my home. I thought of calling out, confronting them, telling them to go home, to leave me alone, but the tightly wound ball of fear kept me glued to my spot. Instead, I wandered through my house, turning on every light like a moth drawn to reassurance, the manic laughter substituting for the innocence of children's games. It wasn't until I heard a light knock at my back door that I felt the color drain from my face. I stayed silent, hoping it was a trick of the wind, but then again came the knock, this time sharp and insistent. I decided I couldn't ignore them any longer, my curiosity had grown too vast, pulling me forward toward the back door. I cracked it open just a fraction, and I saw them, the two boys standing there, their costumes barely illuminated by the dim glow of the porch light. But they weren't just looking for candy anymore, their faces were now almost nurturing, almost saccharine, and they spoke in murmurs that had no relation to the holiday anymore. "Aren't you lonely?" they asked, and the words slithered into my mind like venom, splitting open the dark corners that had learned to fear the silence. For a moment, I thought about inviting them in just to make the madness stop, to tame the swirling chaos they stirred within me, but I held my ground, glaring at their childish facade, desperate for any semblance of caution that might assert that I wasn't losing my mind so soon. "We don't bite," Sam said with a grin that seemed too sharp, two tiny daggers glimmering in the faint light. I slammed the door shut and without thinking, turned the lock, breath trembling as I stumbled back into my hallway, desperate to gather my thoughts. The night dragged on in a vicious cycle of laughter, knocks, and whispers, each sound doubling down on the anxiety pounding in my chest when suddenly, I heard it, my phone vibrating on the table. I could have sworn it was the police, patrolling the area after my call. As I looked at the screen, my heart dropped. It was a text from my neighbor, the boy's mother. It read, "There's something wrong with my boys. Don't let them in. We'll take care of it." My mind blanked in that moment, and then came the realization that I had no idea what was in those boys, and the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize, it wasn't just them. It was something divine and grotesque, a darkness like tar creeping between the walls of this quiet house, and when the electricity flickered, illuminating their faces for a split second, hands pressed against the glass, breath fogging up the pain, I knew I was stuck, lost in the entropy of my choices. Their forms pulsed in the light, eventually blending back into darkness as if they were merely shadows stitched from the fabric of fear, and then came a crashing sound, something like wood splintering against a brick wall. My breath stilled, my heart thudding against my ribcage, and I ran to the window in time to see a figure darting from my yard, but I couldn't see who it was. Was it the boys or someone else, something else? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The night blurred past, a cacophony of terror against my ears, the boys receding back into their home, laughter fading until I could hear the heavy insistence of my own heartbeat and my breath. And before the dawn swept in, I made a decision: I would confront them. But when morning arrived, the shadows dispersed, and a calm fell across the neighborhood. The boys were gone, their family vanished without a trace. I knocked on the door of the house next door, rapping my knuckles against the splintering wood, and when it swung open, a stranger stared back at me, a woman with sunken eyes and the coldness of a grave wrapped around her silence. "Who are you looking for?" she asked, and I felt the winds shift around me. When I described the family, expecting a semblance of recognition, her gaze darkened. "I've lived here for years," she said slowly. "No children have ever lived next door." And just like that, the reality of the boys haunted me like a ghost, those monstrous smiles slicing through my sanity, echoing a question that repeated with no answer: "AITA for not giving the neighbor's kids candy?" The words now strung like a noose around my mind, tightening it into terror. And as I stumbled back into my own home, the lights flickering ominously above me, I realized that perhaps in refusing to give candy, I had given them something much worse: my fear, the key to a darkness that would never leave me. When my grandmother passed away last month, grief wrapped around me tighter than the layers of fabric in my well-worn dark gray coat, the only one I'd ever needed for funerals. It didn't matter that it was the same coat I'd worn to bury my father just a few years before. I remember standing beside my mother at the dining table, her eyes swollen, reflecting a bleak mix of sorrow and irritation as she insisted that I needed a new black coat for the funeral because, in her words, black is the color of mourning, and your father would never forgive you for showing up in dark gray. I didn't understand why a different coat mattered so much when the sorrow it cloaked was the same, but she couldn't fathom that my attachment to that gray coat went beyond aesthetics. Desperate for my own space amidst the chaos of grief, I refused her demands, feeling my heart thud heavily as family discussions dwindled to whispered criticisms directed at me, portraying me as the ungrateful son who couldn't muster the decency to honor his deceased relatives appropriately. The societal pressure to wear a fresh coat became unbearable, and as I walked through the house that echoed with muted memories of family gatherings and laughter, I felt as though the essence of my loved ones lingered in the folds of that same coat, every crease a moment shared, every thread a lesson learned. On the night before the funeral, my mother barricaded herself in her room, and I found myself outside, staring at the growing shadows of the trees in our yard, their gnarled branches twisting like the pain inside me. I was losing everything dear, quickly engulfed by an anxious fog that choked my breaths, and yet, there was a stubborn part of me that clung to that old coat like a life buoy amidst rising tides of despair. Just as I resolved to wear what I felt connected to, I saw the weathered figure of my grandmother, her spectral form flickering in the moonlight, clutching the rope in her hands, just out of my reach. She whispered secrets of the past in the rustle of the leaves, and I felt something shift in my core, a reconciliation with her essence urging me onward. When I finally slipped that coat on, its lingering scent comforting and reminiscent of days gone by, I felt her approval envelop me, more potent than any new black fabric could offer. I may have failed to meet the expectations of a mother mourning her mother, but as I walked into the funeral home the next day, my chest expanded fiercely, fusing the layers of loss into one coherent resolve. However, it wasn't the weight of the coat that caught the attention of others, it was the hushed conversations around me, the scathing glares that sliced through the room and branded me as the odd son. My heart raced as I held my breath for the eulogies, seeking solace in the heartfelt sentiments shared by relatives, but when the speech turned toward traditional attire, my heart sank. I looked around to see the disapproving glances, relatives who I'd only ever seen dressed in black now aimed to paint my grief as colors beyond the spectrum of acceptance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the disdain and disappointment whispered behind my back echoed louder than the sorrowful words being uttered. No. I wouldn't let that coat overshadow the memories embodied in my actions. I held the fabric tight, its significance well known only to me and my grandmother, who had poured her soul into sewing all the buttons that clasped their spirit through intertwining threads of our family's legacy. Halfway through the eulogy, I stepped outside to collect my thoughts, greeted by the crisp bite of late autumn air, which felt like a bitter reprimand, punctuating that pervasive loneliness which seemed to chase me even in the company of family. My resolve wavered as the temptation to conform roared in my chest. I shuffled my feet, heart pounding as whispers about me drifted through the thin walls, shrouding me in a tempest of guilt. Did I really deserve to hold on to my memories, my grief, while causing a rift in my family? Just as doubt flooded my being, a rustling sound came from behind me, an old woman in a shabby old coat, much like mine. She didn't appear lost in sorrow but radiant in the brilliance of her past. I noticed the subtle but defiant sparkle in her eyes. She leaned in and whispered, "Tell me, dear boy, does a coat determine love? Does the ink of fabric hold the grave weight of grief, its fabric woven in time?" A second passed, and I felt the urge to spill my heart to this stranger, her presence igniting a warmth that made the chill of discontent fall away. "Be true to your love, dear heart," she continued, "that is the only thread that carries you through the veil." By the time I returned inside, I had shed the chains of my mother's expectations, ready to face the judging gasps with conviction. I reclaimed that gray coat, stigmata of love laced with mourning. It had become a monument, and I, in my unyielding stance against convention, finally understood that it wasn't a question of right or wrong. It was a testament to the bond shared with those we have buried in the earth, a visual legacy that would haunt the fabric of our lives forever. Yet, just when I believed my resolve would silence the whispers, something jolted me, something I couldn't explain. As I stood there, tears spilling down my cheeks, the air grew painfully thick. A chilling wail erupted from behind me, sending a shiver down my spine as the elderly lady's comforting presence began to dissolve into darkness, the echoes of her words transforming into a strange song filling the room. It was as if the shadows were hungry for the bonds we'd forged, ready to unravel every moment I had thought was sacred. My heart raced again, but this time, it was gripped in vice-like fear. What had I unleashed by clinging to my beloved gray coat? Suddenly, the cacophony of mourning morphed into laughter. Family members were grinning grotesquely, their faces stretching uncomfortably, eyes gleaming with desperation as if they desired to wrestle my coat from me, as if the very fabric prevented them from accessing the shared mourning we all needed to bury. As they moved toward me, engulfing my space with taunts of betrayal, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had focused on me. The burden I carried had morphed into a sort of interloper that would not allow my family the catharsis they so demanded. I was slipping into a darkness that resonated deeply from the fabric, as though the memories that should have kept me rooted were becoming malicious, dragging me into depths of despair where coats had never mattered, but souls did. They were reaching for the coat, their laughter edging into madness, and I realized the family beneath the funeral garb had become ravenous specters, controlled by their hidden grief and impossible expectations. In that moment, grief twisted sinister, submerged in a deep well that churned beneath the fabric I clung to like a lifeline, and all I could do was turn and run, abandoning the whispers, the coiling darkness that craved to drag me into their ocean of shared torment, while my heart echoed with the ghosts of memory that tangled with the whispers of goodbye. Just when I thought I'd escaped the nightmare, I fell through the door, tumbling out into the cold world, only to see the reflection of that old woman, standing on the brink of the graveyard, beckoning me back as shadows flickered around my shivering frame. I screamed, not caring who heard me, trapped between guilt and love, whispers of family now reinforcing the doom that followed on the wind. "Ida," I thought to myself, clutching at the dark gray coat that reflected my soul's turmoil, feeling time unfurl as the threads of my life became wisps of mourning, as fragile and relentless as the hatred swelling within. When I first met Aaron, his odd habit of sitting on the stairs struck me as endearing, a quirk that added charm to his otherwise grounded personality, but after 3 years of marriage, what I initially found whimsical became a chilling source of contention. Every evening like clockwork, perched against the staircase railing, he would sit staring into the shadows cast by the dim hallway light as if waiting for something, or someone. At first, I shrugged it off as a simple idiosyncrasy. We all have our routines, right? Yet, the deeper I delved into his unyielding descent into this strange fixation, the more I realized I was slipping down the rabbit hole with him. Friends raised eyebrows during dinner parties when Aaron spontaneously excused himself for stare time, and I found myself defending him when they laughed and made comments like, "Is he trying to catch ghosts?" My own laughter had faltered awkwardly, but dismissing the behavior outright felt wrong. In my heart, I could feel something lurking in the back of my mind, that unsettling chill that crawled down my spine, whispering that something wasn't right. It wasn't until the night of the storm that I first started questioning his fixation as more than just harmless silliness. The lightning struck so close that the glass in our windows rattled, and the power flickered, plunging us into darkness. I stumbled to find my flashlight, but as I neared the staircase, a strange sound drifted from Aaron's post, a low, hypnotic hum, flowing like water over stones. My heart raced as I shone the beam toward him, but he appeared blissfully ignorant of my presence, completely entranced. Just then, the hum morphed into words, taunting me, whispering my name with an unsettling familiarity that sent ice through my veins. I wanted to reach for him, to shake him out of whatever trance he was in, but my feet felt glued to the floor, unwilling to break the spell. "Aaron?" I finally squeaked. He blinked, his gaze coming into focus, and the look of pure confusion on his face was like a shard of glass slicing through my chest. "What's wrong?" he asked, voice thick with sleep. After stumbling over my words, I told him about the humming, but he shrugged it off as a trick of the storm. The next day, I decided to do some digging, researching stair sitting online, and my stomach fell. It was a bizarre phenomenon some called positional meditation, with connections to cult-like practices, which began painting a sinister picture in my mind. I thought of confronting him but was paralyzed by fear. What if the quiet surrender to the shadows was a sign of something darker, a part of him I didn't know? Days turned into weeks, and the frequency of his stair sitting escalated. Sometimes I could hear him murmuring, having conversations in a language I didn't recognize, while I became a ghost in our own home, hovering in the kitchens and bedrooms filled with toxic dread. One evening, desperation got the best of me, and I staked out in the hallway to confront him. I leaned against the wall, heart pounding, when I finally summoned the courage and confronted him, demanding he quit the odd ritual. But when I reached out, suddenly my world disintegrated as the air crackled around us. "You don't understand," he pleaded, his eyes wide with something I had never seen before, fear mixed with exhilaration. "They are waiting for me. The sound calls." I felt ice twisting in my stomach. There it was, the singular rift between us, with me standing firmly on one side, desperately trying to pull him back from whatever abyss he tumbled into. Panic washed over me, and I insisted we needed help, but Aaron only tightened his grip on the banister, eyes glistening as though he were torn, an entire universe breaking apart behind them. That was when the strange noises began. Every night after he started spiraling, the walls creaked and groaned, shadows flickered just out of view, like they were sneering at our fragile existence. I debated whether I should call someone or wake him, but then I hesitated and drowned in silence. I spent sleepless nights on the couch, terrified to wander near the stairs lest I catch a glimpse of whatever ethereal thing had captivated him. Then one night, just when I thought I could accept our new distorted reality, I awoke to find Aaron standing at the foot of the stairs, staring up into the blackness, taking on an almost ghostly posture, unblinkingly fixated on the top step, where a pale, flickering light began to materialize. My voice croaked as I called out, demanding to know what he could see, but he merely responded, "They're here now, they've come for me." Time shattered, I felt my heart racing and an overwhelming urge to flee. The very shadows that had once draped our home now felt like living entities, swirling and beckoning. In a moment of extreme desperation and instinct, I lunged and grabbed him, pulling him away from the bottom step, terrified of the fate he was so eagerly embracing. The light winked out with a pop, and he turned to me, rage and confusion flaring in his eyes before something in them dimmed, and he finally seemed to break free from whatever enchantment had gripped him. "What did you do?" he murmured, a hint of panic creeping into his voice. I took a step back, horrified yet relieved, realizing I had yanked him back from some tongue-in-cheek path that offered nothing but despair. We spent that night talking. I tried explaining the sounds, the way he'd been acting, the horror clawing through my mind. He listened, nodding slowly, but it felt like trying to stitch a gaping wound closed with nothing but threads of silence. He promised to stop sitting on the stairs, but the truth was, he didn't. He just did it when I wasn't home, and what was even worse? It didn't seem to bother him, a secret pathway he had invisibly carved for himself. The creaking of the stairs became my worst nightmare, a haunting reminder that something darker was tangled in the very fabric of our lives, gnawing at the edges of our reality. A few weeks later, I received a message from a friend who had seen a post on a local forum. It was about stair sitting, but this time the tone shifted towards something darker. Someone related their own experience, detailing people who had disappeared after embracing the dark rituals surrounding stair sitting. My heart crumpled as I understood too well that each tale resonated painfully with our own. I couldn't bear to think that Aaron was edging toward that fate, and that's when I realized it was no longer a simple quirk, it was a siren call to his very essence. One night, I confronted him yet again, my voice trembling as I pleaded for him to talk to me, to let me help him break free from this malevolent pull. He grew distant, his eyes glazing over as he muttered about how the connection was irreplaceable, his lips curling into a smile that made my skin crawl. In the pit of my stomach, I felt doom approaching. The shadows were gathering once again, a thick black fog creeping closer, and I didn't know if I could save him before it was too late. Things escalated into madness. Every time I caught him sitting, whispers would crawl through the house like a sinister echo, and I grew more frantic. I searched for solutions, scoured the web for anything that might help. Most advice seemed like a vague, foggy guide that only intensified the fear of my helplessness, but I stumbled upon a last resort suggestion, a ritual to confront what he now called the calling. I knew it could just as easily backfire, but if it meant saving him, I had to try. The night of the ritual came, and our home pulsed with an ominous energy as I set everything up, the air thick as I placed candles around us, trembling as I prepared to expose the heart of the problem once and for all. I asked him to sit on the stairs, to summon whatever dark force had wrapped itself around him, and for a moment, it appeared as if he was being pulled back into that strange trance as I followed behind, holding tightly to the love I had for him like a shield. When he closed his eyes and the shadows swirled, I could hear the faint sound of whispering, drawing us both in, and my mind was racing as I fought against the tangible hold they had on him. I felt like I was losing him all over again, but I pushed through. I cried out, begging for him to focus on me. Don't you see? They want you, but you're more than this. The energy shifted, rippling through the air, and I prayed for clarity, for him to break free from whatever malevolent grip was pulling him. For an agonizing moment, it looked as if he might not return, that the shadows would swallow him whole, but in a rush of courage, I wrapped my arms around his waist. It was a surge of feral determination that pulled him back to me, and he jolted awake, gasping as the dark whispers faded into silence. We fell back onto the floor, panting heavily. I won't let you go, I cried, holding him tightly, as though I could sew his very essence back together. I thought we would be safe now, that the dark merely needed to be confronted, but a sudden realization crashed over me like thunder. Aaron's grin had shifted from a mere twisted amusement to something far more sinister. He whispered into my ear, "They're still here." The air turned cold, and even as I felt hope bloom in my chest, the shadows flickered back to life, thickening around us, absorbing my disbelief as they reached for my husband, my love, threatening to unravel every shred of light I still harbored. Now as I sit here, heart racing and hands trembling, I can't help but wonder if in my desperate attempts to save him, in defending against that haunting ritual, I've only placed myself within reach of the darkness too. AITA for defending my husband's stair-sitting habits? I think I already know the answer, and I'm terrified of what it may mean for the both of us. When my son turned 10, I decided to throw a party to celebrate his decade of life, inviting his friends and their parents. It felt like a milestone worth marking, a chance to reflect on how quickly he was growing up. As the party flowed through laughter and games, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of memories, gazing at the walls adorned with baby pictures that I'd meticulously hung the night before, each frame a portal to the past, a past where I'd held him tightly for the first time, where every smile he gave felt like a sunbeam cutting through the darkest of nights, especially after his mother left when he was just an infant. My heart raced with nostalgia, thinking of all those moments and how they defined me not just as a parent, but as a person who had faced unimaginable fears alone, and yet I was proud of the heart I had built for him in her absence. But then came a twinge of hesitation as I noticed one of the other parents, a woman named Linda, staring at the pictures with a furrowed brow. During a lull between the games, she approached me, her voice draped in an uncomfortable seriousness that threw me slightly off balance. "You know, it might be time to let go of those baby pictures," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "He's getting older, and it could be a bit humiliating for him someday." I swallowed hard, momentarily dumbfounded as I tried to process the idea of erasing those memories, but I brushed it off, laughing lightly and assuring her that these pictures represented our journey, my love for him immortalized in playful moments. AITA for not deleting my son's baby pictures. I wondered later, but the question lingered uncomfortably. The party continued, disappointment lurking beneath the surface, and as guests slowly departed, I tucked my son into bed. That night, as he drifted off, I sat in the dim light of his room, haunted by Linda's words. The following days fell into an uneasy silence between my son and me. He began withdrawing, his laughter replaced by a hesitant smile, and I couldn't help but feel the pull of something sinister. Was he ashamed of the very memories I cherished? Instead of confronting him directly, I began looking for clues, digging through his schoolwork and activities, hoping to find hints about his secret life outside our home. I found nothing but admiration from his teachers and joy from his friends, yet unease still gnawed at me. His 10th birthday came and went, and that very night, the pictures I had painstakingly hung around the party began to vanish. One by one, they disappeared, and soon, I noticed a pattern as they obscured themselves from me. It was unsettling, knowing moments of my life slipped into untraceable voids, a feedback loop of shadows burying my son's childhood. Every morning, I would awaken determined to hold on to those memories, only to find more of them stripped away, their absence as palpable as the thick blankets of fog that seemed to weave around our house. Desperation carved itself into my heart, driving me to search for digital copies, but attempts to retrieve those files yielded nothing. Friends began to wonder if I was okay, issuing soft words of concern, and I was met with laughter in my son's eyes that grew dimmer every day. The vividness of our shared memories morphed into something dark, and I began waking in the middle of the night, the sensation of tiny fingers grasping at my arm becoming an alarming comfort. I told myself it was just a trick of mine, my exhausted mind grasping at nightmares, but still, there was something sinister lurking beneath the surface, a whisper echoing through the house, saying that I needed to forget, I needed to let go. One evening, I decided to confront my son, asking him directly if he was ashamed of those memories. His shocked look told me all I needed to know, and that's when I noticed it, the first time I had laid eyes on the creeping shadows lining his room, clouds that seemed to pulse and swell. "No, I love those pictures," he finally whispered, but his voice dripped with a kind of languid fear, as if he was too afraid to fight against whatever was smothering the room. In that moment, I realized it wasn't him who felt the weight of shame, it had been someone else all along. Drawing courage from within, I stepped into the room, clenching my fists as the shadows writhed around us like living things, and I shouted the names of every moment, every joyous picture, calling out to those memories before time could bleed them away. In a dizzying surge, the darkness began to retreat, but it was only then I noticed the mirror across the room, its surface reflecting a chilling tableau, dark eyes watching from the other side, a twisted glimpse of a figure I could not comprehend. The realization settled like ice in my veins. The more I tried to hold on to my son's memories, the further they slipped, and every night, I felt that unknown presence slipping through the veil, reclaiming what it believed belonged with it. Either my son or those memories were to be consumed, and I had to make a choice. Heart pounding, I reached for my son, pulling him towards me just as the night enveloped the room in a heavy shroud, but somehow, I sensed the darkness closing in behind us, a whirlwind of dread that seemed to materialize with malevolence. "Don't let go, please," he cried, and I realized that letting go meant giving in to the shadows. With every ounce of strength I possessed, I wrenched open the window, the cool night air rushing in, trying to breathe life back into the fading memories. Every laugh, every moment our hearts shared cascaded into the open air like a haunting melody, and just when I thought the shadow might consume us both, I roared into the night, "I will not let you take them." In that instant, the very fabric of my reality warped, as if the essence of those memories surged back into the room, a blaze of light igniting the darkness, scattering it into nothingness, and for once, I felt our memories solidify around us. But as dawn broke, and we emerged from that battle, I was left alone to confront the remnants of what we had faced. Around us lay remnants of old photographs burned into ashes at the foot of the window, as if those memories had indeed been claimed but then lifted from existence. What remained were the shards of those years, a reminder of the battle where every picture held fragments of our past. As I looked into my son's eyes, knowing the laughter we had shared would forever echo in the silence, I realized I hadn't just fought for memories, I had fought for his childhood. But in that realization lurked a more sinister truth: I couldn't outrun the darkness. While memories might fade, would the malevolence that sought to erase what we loved ever truly let go? I'm left with an irrefutable question: AITA for not deleting my son's baby pictures. Because in this haunting memory of loss, maybe I'm still trapped in a sinister echo, fighting not to forget. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this, the kind that felt ripped straight from the pages of a dystopian novel, marred with shades of gray and uncertainty, and the darkness that lurked just out of sight. My daughter, Hannah, has always danced on the edges of life, a brilliant but misunderstood 15-year-old laboring under the weight of what I thought was autism, her unique quirks, the way she'd chatter about dinosaurs to anyone who would listen, her anxiety sudden like whispers in the wind. My heart broke for her in the cruel world of teenagers, and I encouraged her to embrace her differences, to find beauty in her peculiarities. So, when I overheard her mention her autism to her friends in what I thought was a proudly defensive way, a cute little quirk she believed made her special, my gut clenched with an unsettling tightness. Inviting them over for a study session seemed harmless enough, but when I saw the way they wrapped around her, smothering her with assurances, it drove something chaotic and protective in me to burst out. I never meant for it to escalate, but suddenly I was standing in front of them, my voice defeating the friendly laughter and chatter, declaring that she wasn't autistic. The room thickened with discomfort, and I could see Hannah's face twist into the kind of hurt that sends an icy hand straight through a parent's heart, her friends looking between us like toddlers caught in a watered-down horror movie. The air crackled with something unnameable, and I could see it all unravel, how I had gotten it wrong, or maybe the world had twisted it, maybe I was condemning her to confusion, gaslighting her to fit my expectations, but each word tumbled out of my mouth against the creeping, gnawing terror misfiring in my brain. What if I was wrong? My daughter shrank into herself, her friends standing like frozen statues as I mentally backpedaled, desperately searching for words that could unring the bell of my rash outburst. I tried to explain, autism had never been verified, we had gone through evaluations, and I thought we were just on the edge of understanding her better. I pleaded with the space to breathe again, yet Hannah had already darted past me, eyes filled with something frighteningly close to betrayal, into the upturned laughter of her friends. I could hear the mumbles beneath the laughter, she can't even own her truth, maybe she is just weird, and the guilt sank in deeper than any regret I'd ever felt. Was I trying to protect her from the label, or was I just afraid of what that label might mean for me? As I stood there with my words hanging like a noose, I could feel the dread creep in like a fog, thickening with every second as I recalled darker days, missing the boundary of her laughter where I thought she was comfortable with her identity. I tried to grasp for a semblance of control over the chaos spinning into reality. Panic bubbled in my throat. I wanted to run after her, hold her, explain that I'd love her no matter what, but my phone buzzing in my pocket reminded me there are always consequences to every action. The school counselor calling, each ring a reminder piercing through me. If only I had the words that day, maybe she wouldn't have bolted outside, and maybe the shadows I feared wouldn't have been stirred up at all. The call didn't land fortuitously, it landed like a slap, announcing a meeting that I was supposed to attend to address the teacher's concerns about the transition Hannah was undergoing, entering high school, and the interactions it birthed. I paced the dim hall of our home, anxiety wrapping around my thoughts like a chokehold. I knew what they were going to say, potential loss of funding for her IEP, the looming sense of suspicion that somehow, I was mishandling this brilliant, fragile creature. Hours passed, and dread infused my silence, until finally, I heard her voice wavering outside, moments before her friends were to leave, their chatter growing distant, and then silence settled like a stone. I couldn't bear the thought of facing her unprepared, my mind a storm, the aftermath of my reckless act sitting between us. I walked tentatively to her room, where the door lay ajar, shadows dancing eerily under the flickering light of her desk lamp. She was sitting against her wall, tablet in hand, lost in the glare of the screen, a world far removed from me. "You don't understand anything," she shouted when the door creaked open, resentment wrapped around her words so tightly I felt it brush against my skin. You just want to fit me in a box." I tried to engage her, to tell her what I felt in the pit of my heart, that I was trying to protect her, to shield her from a world that could be unnervingly cruel. But words only poured out, like tongues of fire, igniting our conversation into a full-blown war of truths, half-truths, and fear, all wrapped around the question that haunted us, AITA for trying to define her existence based on something I had convinced myself to believe was in her best interest. As I listened to her cry, feeling that empty sentiment seeping into every crack of my resolve, I realized it wasn't merely the labels but the isolation we both hungered to escape. We were spiraling into a chasm, too deep for either of us to grab hold of the edge. Time blurred until it felt distorted, like watching a movie play out on a wall with others looking in, and in those frantic minutes, I lost sight of how to untangle the lie I'd created over fear, how to repair a fracture that threatened to turn my sweet daughter into someone unrecognizable. Our truths collided violently, and despair coiled tight around my chest until clarity hit harder than any revelation I had ever known. The only way out of this was through her, through listening and understanding, no matter how terrifying that felt, no matter the shockwaves that would ripple through my own perception of her identity. So I knelt on the floor beside her, fingers trembling like my resolve, and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Hannah. I want to understand you. I want you to know you're perfect just the way you are, no labels, just you. Please help me." But even as I said those words, I could feel shadows swirling in the corners of my mind. What if the thing I feared most had already begun to deposit itself into the very fabric of our lives? What if this small fracture between us was just the start of something darker to come? As peripheries blurred and fear turned to ice, loneliness stretched unrelentingly, and I held my breath, hoping that this time, it would heal rather than destroy us. Last month, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of chaos that turned my quiet suburban life upside down, all because of my near-adult son's gluten intolerance, which frankly seemed to surface just as he was nearing 18, insisting on gluten-free meals while treating me like the villain for refusing to cater to his whims. It all started innocently enough when I was rummaging through a dusty box of old family recipe cards, hoping to rediscover the love I once had for cooking, but the sound of my son's voice interrupted my daydreams of homemade pasta, the way he breathlessly announced his new dietary demands as if he had just won the lottery, and my heart sank, thinking of the ravaged gluten-filled meals we shared, the memories now tainted by his self-imposed culinary prison. I told him that cooking had always been a joy for me, but now it felt like I was being shackled with chains with every new gluten-free request, and yet there was something deeper I noticed in his eyes. A kind of desperation that struck me as odd, as if this was less about the food and more about something he wasn't telling me. But when I asked him why all of a sudden gluten was the enemy, he merely shrugged, muttering roughly about feeling better since spring started, and looking for a sense of control in a world that was rapidly falling apart around him. Still, no matter how many times I attempted to reason with him, he insisted on staying gluten-free, refusing any family meals I prepared unless they fit his strict parameters, which left me feeling like I was losing my grip on him. What's worse, he had a penchant for dragging me into his world of restrictive eating, and soon I was spending sleepless nights scrolling gluten-free recipes that felt more like torture than genuine interest. The thought of denying him any kind of dinner out together gnawed at my conscience, yet I was firm in my belief that he was simply going through a phase, the phase of teenage rebellion taken too far. And when he turned the heat up, I finally knew I had to put my foot down, refusing to take him out for meals, holding on to the hope that someday he'd break free of this ridiculous gluten-free fad and return to the son I once knew. My refusal only escalated tensions in our home, with every shared meal now threatening to collapse into an argument, and that's when things began to shift. I noticed something strange about the food I had started preparing. Dishes that had once been a source of comfort now felt tainted, an ominous shadow creeping into my kitchen. The taste of my chicken soup became metallic. Nothing matched up with memories of laughter and family gatherings around the table, as I shivered with the knowledge that something darker lurked within my own walls. Then, one evening while cleaning the basement, I stumbled upon an old recipe hidden beneath a pile of dust, scrawled in my late grandmother's handwriting, speaking of a healing herb, warning of its powers and how it could twist the body in response to the words sent out, and I couldn't help but feel a creeping dread that the reason for my son's sudden gluten intolerance wasn't a passing fad but something rooted in generations of our family, lingering remnants of old-world knowledge entwined with strange and twisted practices that we inherited without question, as if the very act of cooking was a ritual now twisted in ways we never understood. Inevitable outcomes loomed closer with each meal I prepared, twisting the knife further, the moment I faced him again over dinner after unearthing it, trying to mask my concern behind a veneer of normalcy. I watched as he devoured the food, his face twisting with each bite, making me question my own choices. The walls around us seemed to breathe as I asked if he liked the meal, praying for a different answer, when suddenly, everything fell silent. The fork slipped from his fingers, crashing against the plate as he doubled over. The horror on his face resonated with heartbreak. And I finally realized how the tables had turned. This wasn't just a diet where he could choose what to eat. It was metaphorically chaining his essence, his very being, transforming him into something I could barely recognize. Was it the food, the recipes, or something else entirely that sparked feelings of dread? Fat panic rising in my throat as he gasped, pleading with red-rimmed eyes for some semblance of gluten just to make it stop. Each breath he gasped fully paralyzing me into place as fear coursed through me, and, in one moment of despair, I understood. I no longer had the power to create meals that nurtured and healed, but ones that hurt and betrayed. The panic only heightened when I realized time was running out, and my only option was to regain some semblance of control, but that control had slipped through my fingers, out of reach, like grains of gluten he no longer seemed able to stomach. I raced back to the basement, frantically flipping through those weathered recipe cards in search for the herb, hoping against hope that maybe I could salvage something from this mess before it consumed us both, when all the while, I couldn't shake the horrifying thought that I might just be the monster feeding the curse, forced to come to terms with a truth I wasn't prepared to face, that the answer to our demise might have been hidden down in dark corners far deeper than either of us could have ever imagined. AITA for refusing to go to my meals for dinner anymore. Most days, I feel guilty about it, but after the last experience, there's no way I can ever set foot in her house again. It started innocently enough. My husband and I had been married for a few years, and his mother insisted on hosting a weekly Sunday dinner. I used to enjoy those meals, filled with laughter and stories, but after the first incident, enjoyment shifted to dread. The first time it happened, we arrived to find the table lavishly set, but a deep chill permeated the air, something off, like stepping into a mausoleum. I brushed it off, chalked it up to an odd draft or maybe too many candles, but I swear it felt like we were being watched. As dinner began, my husband's mother started talking about her collection. Instead of dishes or porcelain cats, she was referring to disturbing shadows moving in the corners of her home, whispers that crept through the walls. "You must listen closely," she said, her voice dropping an octave as her eyes flickered to the corners. "They have stories to tell." I laughed nervously, hoping it was all a joke, but she was dead serious, her gaze drowning in something dark, almost tangible, and I shared an uneasy glance with my husband. I could see the flicker of worry in his eyes. Dinner continued, each course more unsettling than the last, her smile curving like a crescent moon, and I found myself staring at the chicken, the skin too pale, almost sickly. The way it glistened under the light turned my stomach. As the evening wore on, I could feel a sinister presence lingering just outside the reach of my peripheral vision. After the meal, she insisted we look at her newest acquisition, leading us to a small, dusty room at the back of the house. Inside was a large mirror, its surface warped, the kind you see in horror movies. The reflections never quite match reality. My heart raced as she began to explain. She claimed the mirror reflected not just our images, but souls, capturing the essence of those within its grasp. My husband awkwardly laughed it off, but my skin prickled with unease. Then came the fateful moment. She said we should gather together before the mirror for a family picture, claiming it can bond us forever. My husband jokingly pushed his shoulders back, confidence evidently faltering as I hesitated, the air thickening, a weight pressing down on my chest as I moved closer. As the camera clicked, I felt something shift behind me. I turned and caught a flicker of movement, something dark and serpentine writhing against the wall. I gasped, but when I looked again, it was gone, dissolved into the shadows where the light didn't quite reach. I thought maybe I was just imagining it, but I could sense something watching. We hurried out after that, but not without an overwhelming guilt for my sudden sense of dread. When we visited the following week, I could feel the strange tension ballooning. The air at the dinner table felt tight, like a noose, everything a stifling echo of the past. My mother-in-law, ever so perceptive, picked up on my discomfort. "Do you see them?" she whispered during dessert, her eyes glinting with a strange fervor. For a moment, panic clawed at my throat. I didn't want to admit to any unseen horrors. "See? What?" I responded with a trembling voice, and she only smiled wider, revealing far too many teeth. That night, I couldn't shake an icy grip wrapping around my spine. I had horrific nightmares of dark figures closing in, whispering my name, clawing at the edges of my sanity. It felt so real, and when I woke up, heart racing, drenched in sweat, I resolved to tell my husband I couldn't go back. He took it poorly, surprised by my sudden shift, but I urged him to listen. I knew something was very wrong, but he just laughed it off, chalking it up to an overstimulating imagination. The following week, I decided to confront her. "I don't want to come to dinner anymore," I stated flatly. Her face contorted, suddenly aging before my eyes, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. "But the others? The family needs you," she hissed, and at that moment, her eyes darkened until they were like two voids, and I remembered every ghostly whisper she had let linger in the air. I racked my brain to think of an excuse, any reason to get out of it, but the second I did, she gripped my wrist with a surprising ferocity, and I felt a jolt of sickness clawing my insides. "You're one of us now, you belong to the collection." Her voice was low, rumbling from deep within her. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my hand free. I told my husband I couldn't do this any longer, that I couldn't bear to be part of an acquisition or collection, that I needed peace away from those dreadful dinners. It was easier said than done. Eventually, he accepted my request, albeit begrudgingly. But every now and then, he would ask me why I was being unreasonable, why I couldn't just come back for one dinner. My resolve was tested again when weeks passed, and I started to sense a strange displacement at home, an emptiness settling over our lives. My husband habitually mentioned how much his mother missed me, and with time, I could see shadows again, thicker than before, creeping along the walls at night, creeping into my dreams. My sleep was invaded by visions of dark reflections whispering my name, twisting and warping into shapes I couldn't comprehend. I began hearing muffled words drifting through the air, begging me to return, to join them, but I fought against it, focusing on the love that had once surrounded us. That's when I found the pictures. I was looking through an old family album when I stumbled upon our last photo taken before the mirror. My heart dropped as I studied the photograph. My husband was smiling, but behind him, I could see it, an inky shadow, clawing and stretching out of the periphery, its eyes glinting with malicious intent. I showed the picture to my husband, but he only shook his head, unable to see what I saw through the darkness. Despair clawed at me. How could I return to that dinner table and face those malicious whispers again? That night, I laid awake, trying to rationalize it all when I heard it. Whispering, insistent, calling for me. They were back, the dark figures pressing in closer until I couldn't breathe. In my desperation to escape, I ran to our bedroom mirror, and there, in the reflection, was my mother-in-law, her face twisted and that ghastly smile, a prism of shadows coiling around her as she spoke. "You belong to the collection, sweet girl," she hissed, and with every sip of breath, the shadows deepened, encroaching not just in the mirror reflection but swallowing me into a maelstrom of darkness. I cried out, tore myself away from the mirror, icy fingers chasing me, chasing the hollow pit in my stomach. I made the worst decision ever. I called my husband to come see it. He needed to understand. But when he hurried to my side, she was gone, the mirror only reflecting my panic-stricken face. The whispers intensified, and I gasped as the reflections began to shape into the forms of those I didn't recognize, past family dinners replaying shadows of forgotten loves, lost souls trapped in that grim essence. As I bolted out of the mirror's gaze, dread enveloped me, and a horrifying truth surged as I grasped the reality. That mirror was a trap, an ancient device luring me into her collection, binding me with the dark remnants of her family that would never let me go. I knew, without a single doubt, returning meant becoming part of that burgeoning collection forever, and that's when I finally understood, AITA for refusing to go to my meals for dinner anymore. No, I was simply fighting to keep my soul intact. I hesitated before hitting the send button, my phone trembling in my sweaty palm as I stared at the message I wrote to my aunt, the woman who had been the thorn in my side for as long as I could remember. She was the kind of relative who offered unsolicited advice and criticized every aspect of my life, from my choice of career to my wardrobe, but when she insisted on coming to my house for my birthday dinner, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. It was supposed to be a day for celebration, a day to enjoy with my friends and family, and instead, the evening turned into a twisted family therapy session where I was dissected like a frog in biology class, her sharp tongue skewering my self-esteem. After an hour of her cutting remarks, I snapped, my patience evaporating like water on a hot day, and I blurted out, "I'll never be good enough for you, will I?" All her laughter and condescension stopped, replaced with an icy silence, and for a moment, I reveled in the satisfaction that came from bringing her down a peg. However, that satisfaction was fleeting and morphed into a sick dread when her expression shifted into something unreadable, as if she had just discovered a hidden truth that had lain dormant for years. The silence stretched heavily between us, wrapping the entire room in a smothering shroud, and when my best friend, Mark, attempted to lighten the mood with a joke, laughter just seemed to echo awkwardly around the table, hardly concealing the tension. My aunt finally spoke, her voice low and slow, like molasses oozing out of a jar. "You should really go to your room, dear," she said, and I let out a nervous laugh, thinking she was joking, but her eyes glinted with a mixture of anger and something else that sent a shiver down my spine. I could practically feel the echoes of my words hanging in the air, thick and cloying, as I excused myself and retreated to my room, the walls creeping closer as if they were eavesdropping. It was hours before I heard the sounds of the dinner party winding down, loud chatter interspersed with laughter from Mark that felt far away, an island of normalcy in a sea of dread, but even the laughter couldn't drown out the gnawing in my gut that told me I had crossed a line. When the door creaked open, it was my mother standing there, her face pale. "Your aunt wants to talk to you," she said quietly, and I could see the worry etched on her features. I moved reluctantly, every step weighed down with foreboding until I stepped into the living room, where my aunt sat stiffly on the edge of the couch as if she were so wound up that she might snap. I could feel my heart race, a primal instinct screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to stay, my eyes glued to her, and then she leaned forward, her voice now barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what I sacrificed for our family, do you?" I opened my mouth to protest, to ground her words in some semblance of reality, but I was struck dumb by the raw intensity in her gaze. It was as if she were peering into my soul, dissecting all my hidden insecurities, and in a volcanic eruption of emotions that I couldn't control, she admitted something I never saw coming. Her upbringing had been a nightmare. The house was filled with whispers and shadows of unspoken things, and I had been too naive to notice. For what felt like hours, she unraveled the threads of her own pain, stories of family betrayals and lost loves, everything meeting the gnashing of teeth and the silent screams of the night. I wanted to comfort her, but the more she spoke, the more disoriented I became, ideas of comfort clashing with the venomous way she treated me, and in this warped tapestry of her life, I saw reflection, not just of herself, but a reflection of how she viewed me, as a failure with no hope in her eyes. When she finally fell silent, I stood frozen, the weight of this revelation heavy on my chest as I struggled to find the words to fill the void that had opened between us. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but there was something fractured in her expression. She gazed at me with an intensity I couldn't fathom, and just below the surface, I sensed her disappointment, a flicker of pain that ignited into a wildfire. She leaned closer, seemingly brimming with a need to impart her final lesson. "You must understand, it's not about being good enough, it's about survival. Life is unforgiving, and if you can't understand that, then you have no hope." At that moment, I felt a shiver ripple across my spine. It felt like a threat wrapped in wisdom, a chilling portent of what awaited me beyond the confines of this moment. My pulse quickened, and as I stumbled backward, I could feel that same creeping sensation that had haunted me since I was a child. I turned and fled upstairs, shutting the door behind me, pushing my back against it as if barricading myself against her presence. But the moment I felt safe, the shadows in my room shifted, flickering like candlelight, and I whimpered at the encroaching darkness. It wasn't until later, curled under my soft blanket, that I heard the muffled echoes of conversation between my mother and my aunt downstairs, their voices entwined like two serpents fighting for dominance, until I finally embarked on the road to sleep, where night after night, my dreams morphed into nightmares, my aunt's words haunting me like a sinister refrain, repeating over and over until they carved grooves into my mind, sometimes morphing her face into something monstrous that loomed over me. Days bled into weeks, and while my aunt eventually left, the tension never quite dissipated. I found myself looking over my shoulder as if at any moment her icy presence would return to taunt me, the weight of our conversation still thick and oppressive, suffocating the air around me. And then the dreams grew darker, twisting into something grotesque, her voice echoing with the laughter of children, mocking me while I went untouched, trapped in a glass box that no one else could see. And during those nights, I found myself screaming for my mom, reaching for the warmth of the real world, but she couldn't hear me. I started to notice subtle shifts too, small things like objects moving in my periphery, shadows stretching in ways that defied reason, and an uneasiness burrowing itself in my bones, settling there like an unwelcome guest. That sense of dread culminated on a particularly stormy night when a crack of thunder shook my room awake and I looked up to see someone standing in the shadows, the silhouette barely detectable in the darkness. But just as I was about to convince myself it was a trick of the light, I recognized the warm outline of my aunt. Her expression twisted into something terrible, smiling cruelly, a manifestation of my own fears given flesh, and in that instant, I finally understood the words she'd said. They weren't merely warnings or lessons, they were a curse set to ensnare my soul. I bolted up from my bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal, frantically scrambling for the light switch that ultimately betrayed me by turning on with an unsettling flicker. Yet there was no sign of her. The room was empty but still suffused with that same malignant energy, and I collapsed onto my bed in a heap of raw nerves, unable to process what I'd just experienced. Over the next few weeks, my mental state unraveled. I found myself questioning reality, my own perceptions morphing into a living nightmare, and as the sun filtered through my window, scattering light across my face, it felt like every shadow carried a dagger aimed straight at my heart, until one night, as desperation clawed violently at the edges of my mind, I confronted my mother, voice trembling. I expressed my fears, told her what I had seen, but her face mirrored only disbelief, and that made it worse. She didn't understand. She thought I was merely acting out, a child unwilling to accept the terms of adulthood. It felt as though my words floated into a void, unheard and uncared for, and that's when I realized I had no one to turn to. Weeks became months, my studies suffered, friendships strained, and the isolation consumed me, until one evening when I finally broke down, throwing a glass against the wall, the shards littering my room like fragments of my crumbling sanity. I wished I had been kinder to my aunt, wished I hadn't shouted at her, but wishful thinking morphed into deafening silence as I stood amidst the wreckage, trying to fathom my spiraling demise. Then it hit me, a radical thought that filled me with dread and clarity all at once. What if her curse was digging its claws deeper and deeper with each passing day? My mind was a battlefield of frantic thoughts. Maybe she was right all along. I was destined to be a failure. I could feel it in every shaky breath, every restless night, and one desperate line of hope strung tight in my heart. I needed to confront her, unleash whatever darkness she had thrust. upon me, so, without thinking, I dialed her number, each ring like a countdown to an inevitable reckoning, and when she picked up, that familiar sing-song voice filled the air. "Hello, dear." I could hear the sweet undercurrent of condescension wrapping itself around her words, and I steeled myself, daring to confront my fears. "What did you do to me?" I managed to choke out, the words tumbling raw and unhinged, but there was silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought I had lost her, and then she laughed, a chilling sound that echoed down my spine like icy fingers tracing my vertebrae. "Oh honey, that was just the beginning," she said, and I realized, right then, what terrible sacrifice she had made, no, not for the family, but to ensure that I would carry the burden of her darkness, a parasite feeding off my mistakes. With every accusation I hurled at her now, I felt smaller, more defeated. She fed off my fear, reshaping it into something twisted and wholly her own, until finally, with one last mocking laugh, she hung up, leaving me holding a phone in a vice grip as silence enveloped me, and just as the last flicker of hope threatened to evaporate, I realized something. I wasn't the one who had been cast aside, but I would be the one who would have to break the cycle, and with that ephemeral thought, everything narrowed into sharp focus. Bursts of determination surging through my veins, she could no longer control me, and while the haunting laughter lingered, a defiant fire ignited in my stomach. Just like the day I stood up for myself with words that chafed but were necessary, I would unravel her grip, confront every shadow, and refuse to be her puppet anymore. AITA for what I said to my aunt? Yes, perhaps. But what I'll do next, how I choose to take ownership of my life from here on out? That's the real question, isn't it? It's time to rise from the ashes she left behind. I've never thought I'd question my own sanity, but last summer changed everything. It all started when my best friend, Sarah, announced her engagement. Sarah was someone I grew up with, and we've shared everything from childhood secrets to adult heartbreaks, so when she asked me to be her maid of honor, I felt honored but terrified. The wedding was grand, extravagant by every measure, and I wanted everything to be perfect for her. That's when the dress came into the picture. The moment I saw it, I felt my stomach tighten. The floor-length silk gown was beautiful, but the plunging neckline and sheer sides left little to the imagination. For someone like me, who never felt comfortable in the spotlight, it was a nightmare. As if sensing my hesitation, Sarah insisted I look like a hot bridesmaid because the dress is meant to show off our beauty. I felt like a prop rather than a person, a mere decoration for Sarah's fairy tale, and as I stared at the dress hanging in my closet, I realized I couldn't bring myself to wear it. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands, literally, sneaking some fabric from a craft store to alter the dress a bit. Nothing drastic, just enough to cover my shoulders and up the neckline slightly. I felt guilty but convinced myself that it was okay since I was still honoring the essence of the dress but adapting it to my own comfort. The night before the wedding, I stayed up late, stitching away, feeling proud of myself until dread settled in. What if Sarah saw it? Would she flip? I told myself that all would be fine, that this was just for me, for my confidence, but as I slipped into that gown the next day, I felt a chill run down my spine like I was about to walk into a lion's den. The venue was filled with laughter and shimmering lights, and the moment I stepped through the entrance, I could feel all eyes on me. But instead of ridicule or judgment, I saw nods of approval, murmured compliments about how elegant I looked. It was euphoric until I spotted Sarah, who stood frozen, eyes wide in disbelief, her mouth moving but the words lost in the frantic music around us. Before I could process her reaction, she stormed over to me, seething. "Did you alter my dress?" she asked through gritted teeth, her voice devoid of warmth. I stammered, trying to explain how it was too revealing for my taste, but her expression hardened further. "You weren't supposed to change anything, this is my wedding." I felt the temperature in the room drop, and it became painfully clear that her dream of perfect bridesmaids and perfection had been shattered by someone who dared to adapt their own version of beauty. As she dragged me outside, the laughter from the party faded into a distant echo, and it felt like I was about to be sentenced. "You made a mockery of me," she whispered fiercely. A part of me wanted to yell back, to explain that it was about comfort, not mockery, but all of the words seemed trapped in my throat. Before I could speak, she turned and raced back inside, leaving me outside, alone amidst the fading light. The next hour was a whirlwind of chaotic emotions. It disrupted the flow of the wedding entirely, while I stood there, shaking, feeling like a pariah. Guests started casting sideways glances in my direction, some whispering, while others just outright stared. That's when the uncertainty morphed into something darker. I knew I had crossed a line. The coldness from Sarah seeped deeper inside me as I replayed our confrontation and my own insecurity that led to this moment. Was I really the villain in this story? Or was I merely trying to reclaim a piece of my one fading sense of self at the expense of someone else's happiness? After the ceremony, I retreated to the bathroom, convinced I needed to gather my thoughts, but as I approached the mirror, I noticed something uncanny about my reflection. My altered dress, the fabric I thought was meant to help me, seemed to distort my own likeness in an almost grotesque manner. The neckline I was proud of now began to look jagged and monstrous, the sleeves felt like chains wrapping around me, pulling tighter and tighter. I blinked, and for a fleeting moment, I swore I saw another face, a twisted, smirking mask that looked like me but wasn't. I staggered back, suddenly feeling like I was trapped in someone else's nightmare. Shaking my head, I took a breath, reassured myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, but the fear crawled deeper into my bones. When I finally left the bathroom, I found the reception room in chaos. Sarah was surrounded by a group of bridesmaids, enraged faces all around her, casting accusatory glances at me like I was the villain in their beloved tale. The apprehension in the air was palpable, every laugh a bit too sharp, every cheer unnaturally loud. Before I could even register what was happening, I heard whispers form into words, accusing me of sabotaging the wedding, of making my insecurities the focus of Sarah's big day, as if I was some attention seeker reveling in the chaos I'd concocted. In those moments, I felt their judgment slice through me like a dagger, and that's when I caught sight of my own reflection in the highly polished plates scattered across the tables. I looked at the corrupted image of myself in the dress, and suddenly it struck me, I wasn't merely altering a dress, I was trying to alter my reality, to fit into a world where I didn't belong, where beauty meant something else entirely, something that warped my very sense of being. The music played on, the chaos intensified, and I felt a desperate urge to escape, to shed the skin of my own creation. I turned and fled while they continued to hurl insults behind me, the laughter losing its warmth, becoming a cruel echo that taunted my every step. That night was a blur, a prison of my own making that left me shaken, haunted by the reflection of what I had become. The next morning, Sarah and I spoke. She never forgave me, claiming I ruined her day, that I should have understood the importance of sacrifices for the sake of friendship. But as we parted ways, I couldn't shake the feeling that my desire to alter that dress, to claim my own narrative, had unleashed something far more sinister. I'd broken a bond not just with her, but with a version of myself who sought acceptance in a world where the beauty seemed so unforgiving, and I became a specter of that night, roaming through my thoughts, knowing in the deepest chambers of my mind that sometimes, you might not just alter a dress, you might alter the very fabric of who you are, and in doing so, you risk losing everything that you held dear. When my husband, Josh, died unexpectedly, a part of me shattered, twisting grief and disbelief into a bitter knot that settled heavy in my chest. We had only been married 5 years, but they had been the happiest years of my life. Josh was everything, my best friend, my partner, and the light in my life. Losing him felt like a slow suffocation, a waking nightmare that consumed me as I navigated funeral arrangements and the aftermath of his sudden passing. His mother, Elaine, had always been a complicated figure in our lives. She was supportive yet overbearing, and although Josh struggled with their relationship, I tried to foster peace between them. But after he was gone, that dynamic morphed into something else entirely. When I received the life insurance payout, a staggering 6-figure sum, Elaine immediately insisted that she needed half to cover the funeral costs she'd put on her credit card. I was taken aback. There was no discussion of her covering it or me paying her back later, just a demand as if her procession of grief gave her authority over my choices. I had expected tears, shared memories, and perhaps even a quiet moment where we could both remember Josh, but instead, a dark shadow hung over her eyes while she openly calculated her financial expectations. I remember being at the funeral, standing by his casket, the cool air heavy with an unspoken tension. Elaine had taken charge, orchestrating the details as if it were her final say in a business transaction rather than a memorial, and I can't help but wonder if this was her way of grasping control in a world spiraling out of our hands. With every interaction, her disappointment in me deepened. I wasn't mourning in the way she'd expected, perhaps because, beneath my sorrow, I felt the stirrings of anger that soon flared into resentment. When she demanded I give her money, something in me snapped. "It's not your money to demand, Elaine," I hissed, the words spilling out encased in bitterness. Her face turned ash white, an expression that danced between disbelief and outrage. I thought about the moments I shared with Josh, the joy we built together, and the memories we created as a couple. It felt wrong to surrender that to her. I finally decided to pay for the memorial and cover the remaining costs with the life insurance money, my own damn money, from a plan we had for our future, one I was now simply trying to navigate without him, in a world that felt cold and hollow. I figured it was my right to choose how to honor him, to be the one who decides where that money went, but that wasn't how Elaine saw it. Over the following weeks, she became more persuasive in her demands, trying to warp my sense of obligation by draping her words in grief. "You don't want to forget Josh, do you? You want to honor him," she would say, her voice dripping with concern that felt more like a threat than kindness. I felt like I was being cornered in an emotional chess game, the pieces tipped in her favor. I watched her weave conversations filled with guilt while describing how hard it was raising Josh alone as a single parent, as if this somehow implied I owed her tribute for his very existence. I couldn't shake the feeling that her grief was more about her than about Joshua as I desperately sought the support of friends and family. Most didn't take my side, they echoed Elaine's logic, making me feel like a villain for wanting to claim what was rightfully mine, especially when they'd hear her sob stories. The nights that followed were filled with anxiety, guilt gnawing under my skin while I replayed those unbearable conversations. I felt trapped, like a prisoner in my own house, constantly haunted by my inability to bend to her will. One evening, as I was sorting through Josh's things, a muted ping from my phone snatched my attention. It was Elaine, with a photo of the blurred headstone at the cemetery, eerily illuminated by a waxing moon. Beneath it, she wrote, "This is where my only son sleeps, and you're the reason I have to suffer alone." I could feel the walls closing in around me, the pressure rising as I tried to breathe through waves of panic and regret. Who's the real monster here? I thought and countered my discomfort with a cold resentment. In that moment of blind rage, I decided to take a step farther. If she wanted to make this a game of emotional leverage, I would turn the tables. A few days later, as I watched her elaborate on her grief during family dinners to anyone who would listen, I gathered strength. I made plans to take a trip. I turned the life insurance into an opportunity. I booked a getaway to the mountains where Josh and I had always dreamed of spending a weekend, without a care in the world. It was a sanctuary for healing, and I was desperately clinging to memories of the man I loved. My phone buzzed frantically days before I was supposed to leave. It was Elaine, demanding to know where I was going. "It's none of your business," I retorted. Instead of caving under her barrage of guilt-laden messages, I dug deeper into my anger. I left, erasing the emotional strings Elaine had hoped to bind me with. The mountains embraced me like a lover, and there I found solace. I spent time reflecting on who Josh was, what he wanted, and how much he had fought to keep a distance from his chaotic family dynamics. A week passed in blissful isolation before I returned home to a barrage of voicemail and texts detailing accusations of theft, betrayal, and loss of family. I moved through my own fog of despair, waking nightmares that swirled in my mind as I listened. That's when it hit me. I was at the center of this conflict, one that would not fade away. It culminated one last terrible afternoon when I received a summons in the mailbox addressed in her meticulous handwriting. Her betrayal now turned legal. The walls I had hoped to reinforce around my grief began to shake as dread seeped into every corner of my heart. I never intended to stop her from grieving, and I never wanted the insurance money to be the focal point of a battle for something as precious as memory. But looking back now, I recognize that Elaine didn't just want money, she wanted control over the narrative of her son's life, even in death. I am left to contend with the guilt that wraps around me like a shroud, yet, somewhere deep within, I know Josh would want me to find my own peace, and perhaps there's more to life than the pain of losing someone, especially someone who had to be let go, regardless of the bones they left behind. As I share this, I wonder, AITA for wanting to keep the money that was my lifeline to a man whose life I cherished more than anything? Perhaps it doesn't matter, not anymore. What matters now is confronting the echoes of a love that once lit my way and deciding how best to carry that light forward, alone. I never thought I'd be the one caught in a tug-of-war over life and death, but when my father chose to prioritize his fiancée's surgery over my own, I couldn't help but feel like a ghost haunting the edges of his life. The moment I was diagnosed with a rare heart condition, everything spiraled from familiarity to sheer panic. My required surgery was life or death, an urgent fix to a ticking time bomb inside me. My dad, who had always been both my rock and my tormentor, became distant as soon as his new fiancée entered the picture, an almost cartoonish figure with a flashy smile and an obsession with yoga that somehow transformed my father from the caring dad I remembered into an oblivious shell wrapped around her every whim. I still remember the day it all shattered. I had been staring at the sterile hospital ceiling with its bright lights flickering like the last breaths of hope when my father strolled in, a confident grin plastered on his face, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. "Guess what?" he exclaimed, shattering my concentration. "Diane finally got the necessary approval for her surgery. It's next week." My heart raced, not from excitement, because I knew my surgery was also scheduled for next week, meant to save me from the darkness lurking within. I stared at him, mouth dry and words tangled in my throat, my mind racing with confusion and anger. "What about my surgery, Dad?" I asked, my voice a tremor against the cold efficiency of the room. All he could muster was a casual wave of his hand, a gesture that felt like a dismissive slap to my very existence. "Summer, sweetie, Diane needs this. It's a tough procedure, and I want to be there for her." At that moment, it dawned on me that I was no longer the priority in his life. His fiancée was the one who needed nurturing, love, attention, everything I had hoped my father would give me as I faced the specter of death. The reality hit me like 1,000 tiny hammers. He chose her over me, and I felt discarded, like a broken toy with no real value. I spent the days leading up to my surgery in limbo, wondering how blood could run thicker than water when mere affection had suddenly paled in comparison to a woman who gained my father's affection only recently. I didn't understand how he could be so blind, so utterly subsumed by her charm that he neglected the urgency of what was at stake, his own flesh and blood. On the day of the operation, nurses wheeled my gurney down the long, sterile hall, and as I passed the waiting area, I spotted him. He sat there, hand clasped over hers, laughing at something she said, laughing at the uncertainties of life, completely oblivious to my imminent fate. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, not with fear of the surgery but with rage and betrayal. They were just at the other end of the hallway, and as I was rolled on by, the moment felt like a goodbye, like I was surrendering myself to the uncertain void, pushed aside for someone who had only stepped into the picture months before. I woke up in recovery, groggy and disoriented, feeling as though I had been torn from one world and thrown into another. Dazed, I scanned the room, hoping against hope to see my dad. Instead, only an empty chair remained. I called out to a nurse, my voice cracking, feeling abandoned and lost, needing comfort, just wanting to know I mattered, that I was worth fighting for. She offered a sympathetic smile and squeezed my hand gently. "He's with Diane, dear. She had a complication in her procedure." Those words struck me like a thunderous drum, the realization that I could have been lying in a casket, my father by her side, his heart beating for her while mine lay cold. The pain morphed inside me. It was no longer just physical but a fiery bitterness. I didn't care how selfish I sounded, I was allowed to feel anger at the man who chose someone else over his own daughter. Days merged together, and every time I found the strength to look for my dad, he was still there with her, spinning tales of shared laughter while I lay bruised and silent in the hospital. When we finally spoke, I confronted him, my emotions overflowing like a flood, raw and unrestrained. "You chose her, Dad. You chose her over me," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You took her side, and I was alone." The silence that followed was the sharpest knife through my heart. A slow realization washed over him, but all I saw reflected back was disbelief. "No, it wasn't like that," he shouted, his voice thick with panic. "You're my daughter. You know that." But the words rang hollow, echoes drifting into the void where our bond had once thrived. I left the hospital feeling like I had lost more than my father. I had lost the last semblance of family I clung to, my will to fight diminished by someone who never cared to unravel the damage she had caused. Days turned into weeks, and news of Diane's shaky recovery filled my dad's voice every chance he got while still making excuses for his absence in my life. When I learned she was finally stabilized, I confronted my dad one last time. "You have to make a choice," I whispered, my heart racing as adrenaline coursed through me. "It's either me or her. You can't have both, not while I'm fighting for my life and she's taking everything from me." His face paled, and for the first time, I saw clarity in him, as if my words had finally threaded through the fog surrounding his mind. But instead of answering, he looked away, avoiding my gaze, and my heart shattered all over again. It was then I realized, the true betrayal wasn't his choice to love someone else, it was a choice he would always make, to love her more. Walking away from him that day felt like my own funeral, a weight lifting from my chest as I stepped into the cold air, a marionette severed from its strings. So, yeah, AITA for telling my dad he made a choice between me and his fiancée when he prioritized her surgery over mine? I don't think so. I just wanted him to see that he wasn't the only one who knew what it felt like to stand at the crossroads of life, and without him there to choose me, I simply had to learn to choose myself. When I was 13, my family took me to visit my cousin Chloe, who lived in a small town where rumors wrapped around old houses like thick vines, and where the wind seemed to be a constant whisper of secrets. I adored Chloe. She was always the life of the party, brimming with laughter and confident chatter. But that summer night, everything changed when I ventured into the unfamiliar shadows of her house, seeking the solace of her bedroom, where old posters flaked on the walls and scented candles struggled against the oppressive humid air. Chloe's boyfriend, Tom, was there, and he wore an unsettling grin. "You should really see how easy it is to summon spirits," he said, a spark of something darker glittering in his eyes. I shrugged it off, trying to focus on the flickering candlelight, but his words festered, like a nest of wasps in my gut. Later that night, after he shoved a chair beneath the window and claimed to have called the dead by their first names, we gathered around the small table, Tom urging us to play a game, an innocent enough guise, but I could tell he was feeding off my unease. Chloe twirled her hair, oblivious to the dread crawling up my spine, but despite my protests, curiosity clawed at me until I felt I had no choice but to give in. As we joined hands in a circle, Tom began talking to the darkness, inviting any entity to join us, while a chill seeped into the room. A pressure hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as the candles flickered wildly and the temperature dropped. I shuddered, desperately wishing for a way out, when a flash of cold wind swept through the eerily still air, and the lights flickered, sending all three of us sprawling in panic against the wall. I thought I saw it, a shadow darting behind Tom, and I swear, for a brief moment, I could feel the breath of something unfathomable on my neck. "Stop it," I shouted, the pitch of my voice breaking. Chloe shot me a hurt look as Tom smirked, clearly reveling in my unease. I didn't like the way he looked at her, like she was nothing more than a pawn to be manipulated in his sick game. When I finally pulled away, running down the dimly lit hallway with pounding footsteps, I felt something cold and unyielding grip my heart, like the hand of whatever he had conjured. I stumbled out of the house, frantically kicking stones in the gravel driveway, determined to put distance between me and Tom's sinister antics. As I walked away, I lost track of time, my senses overwhelmed by the buzzing of cicadas and the distant murmur of wind slipping between the trees. I thought, foolishly, that I could shake the feeling of dread, but in the pit of my stomach, I felt I had made a mistake. By leaving, I had done something wrong. But suddenly, a loud crash echoed behind me, and I turned to see the front door swing open, Chloe stumbling out, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you leave?" she wailed, her breath hitching. I could barely form a response, the morbid reality sinking in. Before I could say anything, she yelled, "You made him angry." Confusion overwhelmed me as she explained how Tom had followed me, his demeanor shifting from smug to furious in seconds. I wanted to retreat into my own thoughts but couldn't. Her anguish was palpable, igniting guilt for a decision I'd made. "You shouldn't have played that game," she cried, her body trembling. Moments later, Tom stepped out onto the porch, his expression morphing eerily from anger to something chillingly vacant. "This is all your fault," he said, voice eerily devoid of emotion, before he slammed the door shut. It felt surreal, like being trapped in a waking nightmare, where reality began to fray at the edges. The sound of the waves crashing in the distance melded with Chloe's sobs. I attempted to comfort her, but it didn't help. It felt like I was trying to stop a tidal wave with my bare hands. What happened next is a blur. A strange stillness settled in the air, wrapping around us as if the universe itself paused to hold its breath. Chloe's phone buzzed violently, and she snatched it up, eyes widening. "It's Tom," she whispered, trembling. The heavy air thickened as she pressed the phone to her ear. I stood frozen, the world blurring around me as I listened to her end of the conversation. "No. Please, Tom. Don't say that," she begged, her voice breaking. When she finally hung up, her face was drained of color, a ghostly pallor that terrified me. "He's done," she whispered hollowly, and for the first time, I felt fear gripping not only for her but for what lurked just beyond the threshold of normalcy. It turned out that every time I left a room, every time I faltered, it incited a violent reaction in Tom. The shadows had answered his desperation. He wasn't just losing Chloe, he was losing himself, and in that moment, it felt like a dark loop had eclipsed our lives. I felt as if I had stumbled into a living horror story, where the protagonist's decision to run away from danger only served to amplify the horror for those left behind. Days turned into months, and Chloe would later describe that night as the beginning of the end. She could still hear him speaking in tongues, lost in the dark magic of old stories he shouldn't have touched, and somehow I felt responsible. It wasn't a clear-cut evil, no one died that night, but in her eyes, I could see the shadow crawl deeper, and I knew I had done something irrevocable. My heart ached with the weight of knowing that every sob escaping her lips felt like a piece of the blame sinking into my chest. Each encounter felt haunted, and every family gathering turned sour. The laughter morphed into daggers each time I saw Tom in the corner, wearing an expression of abandonment. He unleashed chaos in a white-hot rage, and soon after, their relationship crumbled, but the repercussions reverberated through Chloe's life like thunder. Was I really an asshole for leaving, or was it merely a breath before the descent into madness? It's hard to differentiate what's tangible and what's not when you're marking the boundaries of your sanity. While we navigate the dim corridors of our past longing for the light, sometimes the door you think leads to the safety of the outside world becomes the very breach through which darkness floods in, and the shadows inside you will haunt you long after you think you've escaped. I still wonder whether the real spirits were the stories we buried, too terrified to admit that they lived not only in the shadows of the night but eternally within us. I've been living with my foster parents for almost 3 years now, and when they first took me in, I felt a flicker of hope after the chaos of my biological family, but that hope quickly fizzled out like a cheap candle. They were nice at first, taking me to parks and letting me choose my favorite meals, but little by little, they began imposing rules that felt suffocating, especially when they decided that they had the right to put parental controls on my iPhone, the one my biological parents gave me before everything went south. That phone was a lifeline. It held pictures of my real mother laughing with me at the beach, messages from my father that said he'd always love me no matter what, and even a few voicemails I kept because they felt like echoes of a past life I couldn't fully remember. When my foster parents broached the subject of parental controls, suggesting it was for my safety, maybe even to protect me from myself after they caught me watching some videos that spiraled into dark territory, I was furious. It felt as if they were digging a grave for my memories, trying to erase everything I had left of my real family. My fists clenched as I remember their voices, calm, yet deceptively firm, telling me it was for my own good. I felt small and powerless as they explained how the internet was a dangerous place, filled with shadows lurking behind every click, as if I'd somehow be safe behind their so-called protective measures. But I'd rather risk it all, dive headfirst into a digital abyss than let them erase the last remnants of my past. I protested, argued, even begged, and when that got me nowhere, I went quiet and resolved to keep my phone a secret from them, using it late at night, crouched under my blanket with the screen dimmed to avoid detection. I fell deeper into the rabbit hole of dark web forums and conspiracy theories, where like-minded souls gathered to share their secrets and fears, convincing myself that they understood the depths of my grief far better than anyone in my foster home ever could. On those sleepless nights, I discovered far more than I ever wanted to know, stories of people who had lost loved ones, tales of sinister disappearances, and whispers of a dark underbelly that thrived in the forgotten corners of the internet. I didn't realize how consumed I was becoming until I encountered a user named Shad0W who claimed he could help people cross over and re-establish contact with the dead using only technology. I was skeptical but intrigued by this account. He had a strange allure, a quiet confidence that drew me in like a moth to a flame. I began engaging with his posts, my curiosity overriding my alarm bells, convinced that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to communicate with my parents again, to hear their voices one last time. Shed0W claimed he needed a special device, the type of thing used in the old ghost hunting shows and a few creepy YouTube channels. I had never considered going beyond my phone, but Shed0W assured me that he had the secrets to make my iPhone a portal, a tether to the world I lost touch with. With his encouragement, I snuck out one moonless night to grab the necessary supplies, a broken radio, a battery pack, and several wires from the old electronics my foster parents tossed out. I felt a thrill run through me as I pieced it together in my room, convinced that while the world saw darkness, I was simply on the brink of a glorious rebirth. As I wrapped the last wire around the makeshift contraption, I felt a jolt of adrenaline. I set everything up, my heart thumping loudly in my chest, hoping this wouldn't just be another wild goose chase. I wanted to believe it would bring me closure. As the clock struck midnight, I opened a chat window with Shad0W, typing frantically, my fingers almost slipping over the screen from the sweat of my anticipation. He told me to make a noise, anything, and focus on the memories I still cherished, the laughter of my real mother and the promises of my father echoing like whispers in my mind. I followed his instructions, my breath hitching as I began to hum a lullaby my mother used to sing. And then, as I held my breath waiting for something, anything, the air around me crackled to life. At first, it was silence, and I thought I was being foolish, but then the radio I'd fashioned let out a high-pitched squeal that made me recoil, and the lights flickered as if responding to my intentions. My phone screen began to blur, the images of my parents rippling like reflections in disturbed water. Suddenly, I heard static, followed by indistinct voices, growing louder and clearer. It was my mother's laughter and my father's deep chuckle weaving together in a painful symphony. I reached out, desperate to bridge the gap, to connect to the only family I'd ever truly felt was mine. As I continued to hum, the voices grew frantic, and an icy chill crawled up my spine, a sense of urgency twisting in my gut. And then, just like that, a voice that wasn't my mother's erupted through the static. "Stop it. Please stop." It was low, plaintive, almost begging, and the warmth of hope quickly twisted into something far more sinister. I felt bile rise in my throat as the tone shifted, becoming furious, accusing me as if it were a vengeful spirit. "You're not supposed to be here." My heart raced, dread pulsing through me as I realized I might have done something horribly wrong, awakening something I could never comprehend. I tried to pull back, to disconnect, but I was paralyzed as shadows began to stretch along the walls, writhing and shifting like dark bile. I could feel their icy breath on the back of my neck, whispers flooding my ears, growing louder. "You're not family. You're not family." Fleeing into panic, I threw my phone across the room, shattering the fragile link, the echoes of their fury clawing at my skin. The shadows receded, leaving nothing but an oppressive silence, but the scar of that encounter would never vanish. I stumbled into the living room in a haze, my heart still pounding as I faced my foster parents, who woke up alarmed by the commotion. Their eyes widened as they saw me, trembling and wide-eyed, and for the first time, I felt the weight of their concern, genuine and terrified, yet I could hardly stand it. They immediately gathered around me, asking questions I didn't know how to answer, probing for an explanation of what had transpired in the dark corners of my mind. I wanted to scream that it wasn't my fault, that I had desperately sought solace and instead summoned only trouble, but the words stuck in my throat. The fear in their eyes stung like 1,000 needles, and just like that, I realized I had no choice. I had insulted my own reality, tearing apart the fragile threads of stability they had attempted to weave around me. As they held me, their warmth was suffocating instead of comforting. It only reminded me of the loss, the real family lost in shadows and confusion. I didn't want them probing deeper, I didn't want to tell them what happened. But that night turned from chaos to something else. It morphed into quiet nights full of investigations into my behavior, full of therapy openness and communication strategies over therapy sessions. They came to discover the extent of my misadventures on the internet and decided to enforce parental controls, the very thing I had fought against, drowning me in an irony bitter enough to make me sick. With each layer they placed on my phone, I felt not protected, but restrained, confined within the walls of their good intentions, a prisoner to their version of safety. My biological family was gone and unreplaceable, and somehow, my foster family turned from bastions of hope into an extension of confinement. I began to wonder, AITA, for trying to cling to the last pieces of my past, for wanting a connection that, as the dreadful echoes of that night reminded me, perhaps ought to remain severed, void of voices calling from the dark. I never thought a simple visit to the grocery store would spiral into my own personal horror story, but that's exactly what happened last Wednesday evening when I encountered a mother and her 8-year-old son, a boy who, at first glance, seemed like your typical kid but quickly revealed an unsettling darkness. I was just trying to pick up a few essentials, milk, bread, you know the drill, when I noticed the boy running wild through the aisles, screaming at the top of his lungs, throwing items on the floor like it was his own personal playground. His mother was oblivious, seemingly texting distractedly on her phone while he sprinted down the cereal aisle, knocking boxes left and right. At first, I thought it was amusing, maybe even a harmless little tantrum, but as I watched him shove a box of Frosted Flakes into another shopper's cart, laughter turned to unease. The slap of cardboard hitting tile echoed in the empty aisle, and I felt the adrenaline kick in as he turned to me with eyes wide and wild, a twisted grin stretching across his face that seemed far too old for a child. I glanced at his mother, expecting her to at least scold him, but she just kept scrolling, her expression blank, as if her son's chaos barely registered. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of responsibility creeping in. I approached her, a knot forming in my stomach. "Excuse me," I said, my heart racing even as I attempted to remain calm. "I think you might want to keep a closer eye on your son. He's causing quite the mess." To my dismay, she looked up, annoyance flashing in her eyes as if I were the problem. "It's just a little fun," she snapped, rolling her eyes and returning to her phone, dismissing me in a way that sent chills down my spine. That grin from her son widened, and I swear I felt the temperature drop. Left with no choice, I decided to confront the child directly. After all, children respond to authority, right? "Hey buddy," I said, squatting down to his level, forcing myself to meet his gaze, "how about we help your mom and clean this up together?" His laughter echoed eerily in the silence, and then he took a single step back, looking me up and down with a knowing glint in his eye that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "You can't make me," he said, voice low and steady, way too serious for someone his age. I felt a chill race through me, a primal instinct to back off, but I pushed forward. "You'll get in trouble if you don't behave." For a moment, it seemed like my words had cut through the fog, and I could almost see the gears turning in his head. But then he just laughed again, this deep, guttural sound that echoed through the aisle, and I recoiled, suddenly feeling foolish for even trying. Almost as if the darkness inside him had risen to the surface, he spread his arms, as if preparing for flight, letting out a shriek so piercing it felt like it shattered glass. The commotion caught the attention of a nearby employee, who jogged over, eyebrows raised at the chaos unfolding before him, but as he stepped up to intervene, the boy turned and sprinted in the other direction, darting down the aisle and knocking over a display of snack cakes. In his wake, bewildered shoppers merely stared, shifting their bags and exchanging unsure glances. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I had no idea that feeling would soon become a reality. As the mother finally began to gather her son, I felt a tiny flicker of relief. Maybe she would see reason after all. But as she stepped closer, her face contorted in anger, she aimed her ire at me. "What the hell is your problem? He's just a kid." A deathly silence enveloped the aisle, and I could hear a pin drop as the other customers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between me and the mother. I could feel my cheeks flush with heat. After all, I was just trying to help. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just a typical grocery store visit anymore, it had turned into something much darker. "He's out of control," I stammered, my voice wavering slightly under the weight of her gaze. "Maybe if you paid attention." But before I could finish my sentence, the boy reappeared behind her, that same twisted grin plastered across his face, but this time, it felt like a veil of malice had descended over the air. "Don't you think she began, but the boy suddenly lunged at me, tackling my legs and causing me to stumble back, the world tilting as I hit the hard floor. My hands instinctively shot out to catch myself, pain sparking up my palms. Glaring up at the ceiling, I caught a glimpse of the kid running toward the entrance, laughter dancing on his lips, echoing in the empty space like a haunting memory. "Get him," I shouted, my voice hoarse as I regained my footing, but my cries were lost in a cacophony of chaos, the mother just standing there in shock, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. It was surreal, feeling powerless as the crowd around us erupted into confusion, and I felt a sick realization washing over me. I had crossed a line, had intervened where I should have simply walked away. With each passing moment, tension thickened the air, and soon, I felt the terror of this bizarre scenario settle deeply in my gut. Crazily enough, it all seemed to happen in slow motion. I dashed after the boy just as he slipped out the glass doors, the cool night air hitting my face like a wave of clarity, and my heart pounding in my chest as I shouted again, "Stop!" He raced toward the parking lot, the glow of headlights flickering erratically, but just as I was about to reach him, a strange sensation washed over me, some primal instinct screaming to run away. And then it happened. I caught a glimpse of his eyes, darker than the night itself, seeming to draw in all the light around him, and I felt my body freeze, paralyzed in fear as if some unseen force was holding me in place. "You can't stop me," he said, the childish lilt of his voice twisted into something unrecognizable, and in that moment, I could swear I saw a flicker of malice, no, a flicker of something far worse, deep within him that confirmed my worst fears. This child was not just out of control, there was something inherently wrong with him. Every instinct screamed for me to turn and flee, to escape the darkness that threatened to engulf me, but I was rooted, lost in those eyes that shone with an ancient malevolence, an echo of something that should never belong in a child. I felt the wind whispering warnings to me, but the moment I finally turned to run, I felt a sharp pain straining through my back. Looking down in disbelief, I realized that the boy, I don't even know how, was suddenly upon me, and he had stuck a butcher knife into my side, the world swiftly fading into a crimson haze as pain engulfed my senses. Everything became muffled and distant, the screams, the sirens, the horrified gasps of passers-by became a bizarre symphony, swelling as I crumpled to the ground, the cool concrete cradling me as I gasped for breath, caught in an inescapable nightmare. As I lay there, eyes flickering shut against an abyss that threatened to swallow me whole, I could hear the mother call out to him, "David, come back." But her voice sounded far away, as if it belonged to another world. In my fading moments, my mind was a whirlpool of regrets, of could-haves and should-haves, realizing too late that when the line between innocence and darkness blurs, it is often the innocent who pay the ultimate price. All I started with was a simple commentary on parenting, and now I was just another casualty in a tale nobody would believe. I never thought I would reach a point where I had to make a post like this, but here I am, desperate for validation on whether I'm the asshole in this twisted situation. It all started last spring when my brother, Mark, began showing up unannounced at my apartment. At first, I thought it was just a minor inconvenience. He'd drop in with some lame excuse about needing to borrow a tool or ask for advice on his car, but as weeks passed, his visits morphed from casual to obsessive. It wasn't long before I noticed things started to feel off. He'd expertly manipulate the conversation to shift focus to my life, probing about my job, my friendships, my love life, as if gathering data to fuel some hidden agenda. I brushed it off as sibling curiosity at first, shrugging it away until that one fateful afternoon I came home from work to find my door wide open. Panic washed over me as I rushed inside, heart racing, to find my apartment completely intact. But there, in the living room, was a note rested on my coffee table, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "You need to be more open to me." It unnerved me more than I could express. Was I being paranoid? I decided to confront him, and when I did, Mark laughed it off, insisting I was reading too much into it. But I was no longer comfortable with him just popping by whenever he felt like it. I needed my space. So, after much deliberation, I made the decision to change the locks. When I told him, he looked at me, the laughter draining from his face, replaced by something colder, darker. He said nothing but walked away, a shadow crossing his features. A week later, I woke up in the dead of night to the distinct sound of my door jiggling. My heart pounded as I froze in fear, listening carefully, praying it was just an old pipe or a figment of my imagination. But no, the rattling persisted for what felt like hours, and then it stopped suddenly. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just outside, waiting for the right moment to breach my sanctuary. I buried myself in my blankets, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down I knew. Mark was relentless. The next morning, I found more notes scattered around my apartment, all manner of things from "I just want to help" to "Why can't you see I'm your only family?" It was suffocating, the pervasive sense of dread that began to chase me through my days. I felt trapped in a nightmare, and the lines of love and manipulation blurred until there was nothing left but darkness. I decided to take action. I went to the police station and filed a report. They couldn't do much, just a recognized nuisance, they said. As I left, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I couldn't even trust the people who were supposed to protect me. Every break in my routine, every sound outside my window incited pure terror. I looked for any chance to escape, weekend getaways, late-night shifts, anything to avoid the haunting presence of my brother. And then one stormy evening, with thunder rumbling and rain pouring like the sky itself was breaking apart, someone banged on my window. It was Mark, drenched and grinning in a way that set off alarm bells in my mind. "Surprise. I thought I'd come over to help you with that article you're working on." The sickening jolt of dread coursed through my veins. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing as I quickly mumbled something and darted to the door, locking it just as he reached for the handle. But I could see him through the peephole, my own brother. His grin widened, but his eyes were wild, icicles of twisted madness in the torrential downpour. With every thump of his fist against the door, the world outside blurred, leaving only a whirlpool of confusion and fear. I was losing my grip, feeling as if I was slipping into some alternate reality. Was I the villain for wanting space? Was it wrong to feel caged by someone who claimed to love me, or was I just pushing him away? I yelled at him to leave, realizing too late the trap I had walked into, his soft chuckle echoing unnervingly through the night. But I'm your family. We're supposed to be close. I finally lost it, my voice cracking as I screamed, aren't you supposed to care about what I want? And just like that, the laughter stopped. Mark's expression shifted, his mouth tightened as he said, you think you can change the locks on family? You can't escape me. I bolted to my bedroom, fumbling for my phone, but as I turned, I saw him standing in my living room, having somehow slipped through a window I thought I had locked. My breath caught in my throat as he said very calmly, it's not just the lock settling the score, sis. You need to learn that family always finds a way in. Then everything went black. When I finally regained consciousness, I was sprawled on the floor of my apartment with no memory of what happened next, but one thing was clear, in that moment, I truly understood what it meant to be the scapegoat in a family tied tighter than the strongest chain, each link weighed down with the burden of madness. My brother was no longer just a sibling, he had become something beyond that, something dangerous, twisted. Now, as I sit here, typing this, I can't help but wonder if I did the right thing by confronting him, changing the locks, and asking him to stay away. But the truth is, I still hear his laughter echoing through the walls, and that little voice keeps haunting me. AITA for telling my brother to stop coming unannounced? I think I might be the biggest fool for thinking I could change the locks on the chains binding us. When I married Derek, I knew right from the start that I'd have to navigate the murky waters of his past. After all, his ex-wife, Lisa, hadn't just exited his life like some forgettable chapter. She was a ghost that lingered in every conversation, in the decorations of our shared home that sometimes felt like borrowed nostalgia, and most importantly, in the shadow of her new wife, Anna, who, as odds would have it, turned out to be someone who had an unsettling tendency to insert herself into our lives. It all came to a head one gloomy afternoon in early November, when Derek and I had just settled into our weekend routine of lazy brunch and Netflix. My phone buzzed with a message from Lisa, and I braced myself for the usual pleasantries, some innocent inquiry about the kids, maybe, but as I opened the text, I found Anna's name splattered across the screen. I heard you don't want to meet me. That's okay, I understand your feelings. It rattled me, and I tried to shove the inexplicable anxiety down, telling myself it was merely a misguided attempt at something resembling friendship. The truth was, the more I read about Anna, the new wife in a life that should have been severed from Derek but wasn't, the more I could feel the small hairs on the back of my neck prickle, sharper than any ghost's whisper, and it wasn't long before my polite refusals morphed into something darker. I told Derek I didn't want to meet her. He frowned as if he was about to argue, and years of marital negotiations played out in my mind, but thankfully, he kept his mouth shut, a shift I accepted, thinking perhaps he was on my side after all, until one fateful Friday night when the walls felt too thin and the shadows seemed to breathe. I woke in the middle of the night to a banging sound, loud and urgent, enough to rattle the very foundations of our home, but panic surged through me when I realized the noise was coming from the back door, where our kitchen met the dim alley behind our condo. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the sound, heart hammering in my chest, but just as I reached for the door, a figure darted into the darkness, a fleeting glimpse that caught my breath, Anna, standing there for just a second before vanishing into the abyss, and I swore I could taste her defiance in the air, a bitter tang tinged with a sense of ownership that made me feel as if she was daring me to come out and play. All the warning bells were clanging in my mind. One moment, I felt frozen, and in the next, I was racing back to my bedroom, where Derek slept soundly, blessedly unaware of the chaos of women that seemed determined to ruin our lives. Days passed in a surreal blur, where Anna's shadow loomed larger, and I came to know my own home as a battlefield. I began to hear whispers when no one was around, felt prying eyes watching through curtains when the sun went down, and every so often, I'd catch sight of a figure disappearing into the corner of my vision in the dimly lit spaces of our life. It got to the point of paranoia. I convinced myself Anna was playing some cruel game, trying to push me into a confrontation that, for her, would be thrilling, as if my refusal to engage with her was some sort of challenge she was determined to win. I lashed out at Derek more than ever, accusing him of being too close to his past, a ghost silently haunting our house even during daylight hours. But as it often goes in life, I soon learned that my sleepless nights came at a cost. One rainy afternoon, I received a surprise visit from Derek's sister, Rachel, well-intentioned, but her chatter about family gatherings, during which Anna had been graciously invited, felt sharp, like a knife twisting in my gut. It was on the tip of my tongue to unleash the devils I'd been keeping close, but I bit down murkily, burying my grievances underneath polite smiles, and yet my mind wandered back to Anna, worrying and careful like a spider spinning a web that seemed to ensnare us all in its delicate but unforgiving threads. When I finally reached my breaking point, it was during a dinner party, where the corny ambience of laughter and clinking glasses masked the war raging in my heart. Derek's family, including Lisa, stood in our backyard under twinkling fairy lights, and as if summoned by dark magic, Anna appeared, lovely in an ethereal way that cut into my self-worth like a knife. She greeted everyone breezily, and the taunting gleam in her eyes while she exchanged pleasantries with Derek felt like high stakes. Couldn't they see that she was here to replace me? That I would ultimately become just another piece in a twisted puzzle built on miscommunication and misunderstanding? As I stepped outside, my heart raced cold in my chest. I realized something had to give. In the very first moment I tried to confront her, adrenaline coursing through my veins, things spiraled faster than I could comprehend. "I don't want to talk to you," I asserted a bit too loudly, well aware that the party had all but faded into the background of our confrontation, glances darting between us as if we were the main event. But Anna just laughed lightly, brushing her hair back and holding my gaze with a fierce confidence that knocked wind out of me. "Why do you refuse? You don't have to be so afraid, you know. There's enough room in this life for all of us." Those words hung in the air like a curse, and an inexplicable dread gripped me, transforming my knees into gelatin. My refusal solidified into some sickening reality, that I was terrified, yes, terrified of this woman, this specter of Derek's past and the embodiment of a person who wouldn't just let go. She wanted to stake her claim, and here I was on trial for an invisible crime, sentenced simply for existing next to a ghost. Their laughter felt like a mocking eulogy to a life I had desperately tried to forge, and the air turned thick with tension, so palpable that I could likely cut it with a butcher's knife. It overwhelmed me until the needs for confrontation morphed into something twisted, darker. I wasn't just refusing to meet her, I was staring into a chasm, both terrified and intoxicated by the possibility of falling right in, resisting the call of something sinister I couldn't articulate. And then, just like that, it happened. The lights flickered overhead, plunging us into a surreal dance of shadows before a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated Anna's face, and in that single flicker, her grin twisted into something malicious, the kind that made my heart pound. The conversation fell silent, as if the world could feel the tremor of impending doom, and in that moment, I knew something in me snapped. I couldn't just refuse to acknowledge her anymore. The fear that had been simmering transformed into sheer defiance, something wild and unrestrained. With a smirk, I stepped forward into the abyss, ready to confront the specter that had taken over my life, but the response from Anna was chilling. She took a step back, eyes wide and retreating. It was then I realized I'd become more than just a new player in a game of old lovers. I'd become something darker, something powerful that didn't intend to share. In that strange moment of clarity, with my newfound conviction, I finally understood the horror that wasn't found within Anna's taunts or sneers, but within my own reflection warped within a fragmented mirror of shared pasts and futures. I was battling not just for myself, but for Derek, and the life we had built, and as Anna retreated under the gaze of our onlookers, I couldn't help but wonder, was I really prepared for what I had awakened? What dark consequences awaited us all? The space shimmered with unspoken words and unresolved fears, each person witnessing the birth of a new tension, and amidst it all, that question echoed endlessly in my mind, AITA for refusing to talk to my husband's ex-wife's wife? But truthfully, maybe it was time to discover what lay beneath the surface, to revisit every last secret buried in the darkness that would ultimately either free us or consume us. It was a red-eye flight from Los Angeles to New York, and after hours of cramped leg space and the constant hum of the engines, I was relieved to finally feel the plane start its descent. As we touched down, the anticipation of reuniting with friends for a long-awaited trip filled me with excitement, but that joy quickly dimmed when the plane rolled to a stop and the chaotic symphony of kids crying and parents shushing them erupted around me. Just as I unbuckled my seatbelt, a mother in the row ahead of me started shouting at her child, a little boy, maybe 5 or 6, who had transformed himself into a living tornado of rage and defiance. He was poised to unleash a tantrum that could rival any natural disaster, kicking the seat in front of him with relentless fury, and then it happened. The mother, rather than reassuring him, began to scream, and her voice pierced through the dull noise of the cabin like a siren, as if the whole plane had become a stage for their performance. When the seatbelt sign turned off and the doors opened, I stood up eagerly, ready to move forward, when this little monster darted into the aisle, throwing his arms up and screaming as if he believed he could bring down the whole aircraft with just his cries. Corners of people's faces contorted with annoyance as frazzled parents tried to reason with the child while he stomped his feet, flailing like a banshee. In my peripheral vision, I noticed an older man behind me. He looked ready to snap, his patience already worn thin by the chaotic scene unfolding before us. As he shouted at the kid to stop acting like that and to get out of the way, I felt an unfamiliar pull of anger rise within me, an unyielding impulse ignited by worn-out anxieties of my own. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was standing there, frozen in indecision, 1,000 possibilities passing through my mind. Should I step aside? Should I yell too? But then an audacious thought crossed my mind: why should I? It wasn't my child throwing a fit, and why was the rest of the world suffering under this child's tantrum? As the tantrum escalated, I stood my ground stubbornly. The boy began crying harder, his wails echoing through the cabin as he kicked his little feet against the aisles, making it impossible for anyone to get past. I watched as parents attempted to calm him down, but their efforts were futile. The little boy's pleading screams devolved into a cacophony of noise that seemed to seep into my very bones. I finally whispered, "You've got to be kidding me," under my breath, just as the elderly man behind me shoved my shoulder gently, signaling me to move aside, but instead, I clenched my teeth and grit my teeth, unwilling to give an inch. "Move," he exclaimed, hitching his backpack and glaring at the kid as if he could force him to cooperate through sheer will. It was surreal watching two adults struggle against the manic outbursts of a child, and in a fit of anger, I turned around and snapped at the man to back off, that this had nothing to do with me, and I wouldn't be the one to budge. My voice was louder than I intended, and a wave rippled through the crowd like I had unleashed some invisible force that suddenly everyone had felt. It silenced the room momentarily, and the little boy looked at me wide-eyed, screen-printed with confusion. The mother, no longer raising her voice, stood still with a glazed expression, her hands frozen on either side of her son, the heat of shame and frustration radiating off her. I was taken aback, realizing I was now at the center of this whirlwind, a moment where rage intertwined with guilt as my heart raced in my chest. I felt a sickening mix of satisfaction and regret, unsure if I had escalated the situation or somehow brought relief. I had thought I was being resolute, but instead, I found myself entangled in an emotional disaster. The tension in the cabin thickened, and as the seconds stretched into forever, the boy finally broke. He let out one last defiant scream and surprisingly spun around, sprinting back to his seat, still crying as loud as his lungs could manage, while parents finally scooped their children up and started to clear the aisle, moving around me like I was an immovable object in a world of chaos. But then something terrifying happened. As he settled back into his seat, I suddenly felt a rush of nausea sweep over me, an all too familiar feeling that accompanied moments of pure dread, a thought creeping into my mind that mirrored the chaos. I hadn't just deemed that child a nuisance, had I? I was now a villain in this story, solidified in place and surrounded by sympathetic glares from onlookers who had witnessed my outburst. Words flared hot at the tip of my tongue as I turned to the older man, a stranger who I now saw as a comrade in this blender of emotions. "I'm sorry," I stammered, a futile attempt to mend the invisible rift that had formed, but he laughed, a low, gravely laugh, and nodded, almost approvingly. "You didn't deserve that. No one did. You're not their babysitter," he replied, causing me to feel both relieved and more lost than ever. It dawned on me in that moment, this whole shambolic episode of human suffering was not only about the child, it was about me as well, but the more I dissected it in my head, the more I knew my reaction was rooted in my own tumultuous past. What I thought was just an inane airplane encounter was turning into a dissection of my own character weaknesses. I had endured far worse moments long before needing an emotional outlet against the harrowing memories that had seeped into my mind over time, of feeling trapped, of feeling like I couldn't escape my own emotional dysfunction that had caused echoes of laughter and anger to crumble into one another through time. It wasn't just about parenting, it was about trauma. This innocent child had opened a can that I wasn't ready to confront, and suddenly a flash of clarity struck me like lightning. What if I needed to be shaken for a reason? Luckily, as the line began to move, I found myself taking my first tentative step toward the exit, lingering behind the furious mother and her misbehaving child, drifting just far enough back to feel safe yet still close enough to engage in the raw humanity of what had unfolded. I made it to the door just behind them, and when we finally stepped into the cool air of the terminal, I caught a glimpse of the boy, still ensnared in his mother's frustrated grip. Their dynamic struck me as bittersweet, two broken souls meeting at an intersection of despair. At the last moment, I realized that the world isn't simply black and white, every outburst is a story, every tantrum wrapped in layers of the unexplained, and in that instant, I forgave us all, even myself, for simply being human. With every part of me still unsettled, I merged back into the flow of travelers, carrying the weight of that awkward confrontation, caught in a web of empathy that lingered in the air, a breath away from devastation and understanding, and as I walked through the throng of people, I hesitated for just a moment to turn back, half expecting to catch the boy's eye, but instead, I found only the fleeting silhouettes of silhouettes blending into the crowd of hurried passengers, their lives intersecting through the storm, never to meet again. I used to think conflicts in marriage were easy to resolve. After all, how hard could it be to express your feelings about something that's bothering you? But that was before the Fruit Loops incident, the night everything changed between my husband Eric and me. It began innocently enough. I was exhausted after a long day at work, and as I shuffled into the kitchen, I spotted Eric happily indulging in a massive bowl of cereal, the artfully vibrant loop smothered in milk, his face illuminated by the glow of the fridge light. I greeted him with a smile, expecting just a quiet moment to connect after a hectic day, but the atmosphere soured when I saw he already had a second bowl prepared, as if realizing he'd need it to satiate some insatiable hunger I didn't even know he had. My initial amusement turned to annoyance as he spooned a heaping helping into his mouth, the sound of the cereal crunching echoing in the dimly lit kitchen, like a cruel remix of my own spiraling frustration. "Are you really going to eat that much?" I asked, trying to inject a hint of humor into my comment, but Eric shot me a glare that poured ice down my spine. "What? It's just cereal," he replied, voice tinged with defensiveness as if I'd accused him of committing heinous acts. It struck me that maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting, so I shrugged it off and made myself a much smaller bowl, but the unease lingered like a ghost I couldn't shake. I sat across from him, and we could barely look at each other as the silence stretched, punctuated only by the clinking of spoons and slurping milk, hollow reminders of our widening disconnect. Trying to break the suffocating tension, I suggested we talk about our days, sharing a story about a coworker's mishap that had everyone in stitches, but Eric nodded in response, his focus unwavering from the bowl as if I were speaking an entirely different language. I could feel rage bubbling beneath my skin, a helplessness morphing into something primal, and I couldn't help but feel he was deliberately ignoring me. Finally, in a moment of clarity wrapped in a shroud of frustration, I blurted out, "It's kind of selfish to hog all the cereal, you know." Silence ensued. Eric's spoon clattered against the bowl, the sound sending a shockwave through my chest. "Selfish? You think eating a bowl of cereal makes me selfish?" he asked incredulously, his voice rising, anger twisting his features into something I almost didn't recognize. I was tired. "Just because I want to enjoy my food doesn't mean I'm putting myself before you." The atmosphere became thick with unsaid words. I felt a reservoir of tears threaten to spill over, and I wasn't sure why I felt so shut out. My unease blossomed into outright confusion because it was just cereal, wasn't it? What did it even mean when we hurled accusations back and forth like cold cuts at a deli, the oddity of the situation spiraling toward an absurd conclusion? "You're making a big deal out of nothing, Eric," spat, indignant, and for a fleeting second, his ire glanced off my armor of hurt. Perhaps I was making a mountain out of a molehill. But then came a wave of bitterness that I couldn't ignore. Wasn't this about more than Fruit Loops? It was about our relationship, the chasm that had grown between us, countless nights of silence more poignant than words, several missed connections disguised as life's daily grind. I felt utterly alone in my desire to bridge that gap, a rhythmic pulse pounding in my ears as he continued to scoff at my words, chewing through each syllable as if they were the very cereal he deemed more important than our conversation. The bowl became a battleground as I accused him of being neglectful, focusing on superficial things instead of the underlying issues that screamed for attention. "If I can't even talk to you about our basic needs, who am I to share my life with you?" I felt raw, exposed, like a creature caught in the harsh light of his casual apathy, but he refused to budge, scoffing as he dug into another helping, the brightly colored pieces swimming in milk, blissfully unaware of the maelstrom of emotions swirling just a few inches away. I got up, slammed my bowl in the sink, and stomped toward our bedroom, where the weight of my words loomed over me. I slumped against the door, trying to catch my breath as I felt the tears tumble down my cheeks. Am I the entitled one here? The nagging voice inside me echoed as guilt washed over like a tidal wave. But rather than reflecting on my own pain, I wondered if he could truly remain indifferent while the world burned around him. This was more than cereal. It was the way he could eat so blithely while ignoring the hollow sounds of our lives barely touched by intimacy. Hours passed, my thoughts spiraled until they felt tangible, raw like a wound, and when I heard the soft patter of his footsteps creeping toward our bedroom, I thought maybe we could reconcile. But instead, Eric stood at the threshold, and before I could even summon a calm demeanor, he mumbled something unintelligible that sounded much like an apology but felt entirely hollow, just a way to end the night without earnestness. I could see it in the way he avoided eye contact, shame shimmering briefly only to collapse under the weight of his pride. I muttered something back, words soaked in resentment, and, in that moment, in that oh-so-ordinary kitchen illuminated with memories and the smell of fading milk, I realized this dinner was more than a bowl of cereal. It had come to symbolize everything gnawing at us beneath the surface, the inability to dig deeper, the hesitance to face what was truly wrong. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, allowing exhaustion to wash over me, yet sleep eluded as I replayed the events of the night like a reel in slow motion. In that ache of solitude, I understood something crucial. It wasn't about cereal anymore, it was about feeling unseen. The next morning was a chilly void of unspoken words. You could cut the tension with a knife as neither of us acknowledged what had transpired. Eric settled back into his routine, stepping lightly with precise purpose, brewing coffee while I poured cereal, determining to trudge forward despite the weight of resentment. Should I have bitten my tongue? Should I have just let him indulge? But beneath that question lurked a deeper one: was I wrong for wanting recognition? Days turned into weeks, and while practical matters continued as they always did, I felt the shift, how we danced around each other more carefully, like two actors performing in a play where the audience was unaware of the tension building offstage. I found solace in the quiet of night when I could replay our childish skirmish, flesh and blood memories tinged with bitterness, wondering if we were just prolonging the inevitable, forcing ourselves through to the end of a dull script. And then, one evening, as I flicked through Netflix in a desperate bid to create a new shared experience, I offered to make dinner. Maybe my gesture would be perceived as an olive branch. But after gathering ingredients and cooking a meal for two, I hesitantly beckoned Eric to our table, fiery lights dancing against the walls, and proposed we eat together instead of watching another episode without so much as a glance or a word exchanged. He looked up, reluctance flickering across his face as he joined me, but the table was a quiet battlefield once again, simmering words lingering in the corners of our postures. I couldn't hold back the flood anymore, all those hidden truths threatening to explode, the silence we'd sustained too long wrapped around our throats. You know, I called you selfish for a reason because you're not the only one hurting here, I said, heart racing, pouring out my frustration, and finally giving way to the aching loneliness I felt. His brow furrowed as if I had disturbed some old, long-buried pain. When he finally spoke, it was in a whisper laced with vulnerability. I didn't mean to shut you out. I thought Fruit Loops would fill a void. I didn't realize I had created another. In that moment, I understood what we'd both been trying to stave off: the hurt, the apathy, the mounting discontent. But what terrified me more than the fight over a bowl of cereal was the recognition that maybe the things we felt compelled to fight over were only reflections of the storms brewing beneath the surface. And that night, instead of cereal becoming our destruction, it transformed into something unexpected, an offering of understanding, a chance to heal the wounds left festering in the shadows. We each took a slice of the truth, and through the darkness, the glow of hope started to dance in the periphery, a tiny flicker promising that even the smallest battles could become the beginning of something new. And as we sat there, spooning in unison, I realized sometimes it takes a bowl of cereal to really see each other again. When my wife and I first decided to have a child, we envisioned a picture-perfect family life, complete with spontaneous road trips and Sunday barbecues, but reality is often sharper than expectations, and soon daily life morphed into a relentless grind dominated by one irritating truth. Our 3-year-old daughter, Emily, was a nighttime terror, waking up screaming from apparitions that seemed to haunt her dreams, and after several weeks of sleepless nights, I found myself wrestling with an increasingly impossible choice. So, when my wife, Jessica, suggested right after dinner one Tuesday that we start taking Emily to daycare, I felt like I was being edged toward the cliff of parental sanity. She's sleepy, I thought. She won't sleep at daycare, she'll scream for me. I braced myself for weeks of bargaining with a toddler over nap time, so when it was suggested that I take Emily to daycare, a mere 20-minute drive in the same direction Jessica takes each morning, I hesitated. The logic seemed to infuriate me. How would it save us time, really, when I could just keep her at home where we had a semblance of control over our lives? I could hear her tiny voice, coffee-stained with the innocence of childhood. "Daddy, please don't make me go." And it twisted my insides. I became emotionally overdrawn, my derailed thoughts split between tender affection for my little girl and the desperation of exhausted parents craving normalcy. In the end, feelings won, and after more sleepless nights than I could count, I blurted out, "AITA for not taking Emily to daycare when it's just a 20-minute drive in the same direction as you, Jess?" What followed was the kind of argument that left both our hearts pounding and eyes stinging with tears. She couldn't understand how I could deny our daughter some structure, something stable to ground her restless spirit. My reluctance, according to Jessica, was merely a selfish desire to pacify my own guilt. But every irritation piled like flammable kindling, till last week it burst into flames. Emily woke up again, shrieking about monsters, her eyes wild as if they were windows to a thrilling, chaotic nightmare, and I felt the heat rise in my chest while my wife hissed at me to make that drive to the daycare. I refused, heart racing, sweat forming on my brow, burying my head beneath the pillow, convinced if nothing else, at least she was safe with me. All the what-ifs clawed at me. What if I was a terrible father, a godforsaken monster who could not endure the screams of a scared child? I was alone in this decision, swimming in a tidal wave of guilt as each morning unveiled a fresh list of rear-end kisses. The shame burned bright, especially when Jessica resorted to the ultimate parent's leverage, silent treatment, and the bitterness festered, hardened into resentments neither of us embraced but neither could deny. Then came the night it happened. Emily woke me up, summoning me with trembling babbles. An unexplainable chill lanced through me, almost sent me shivering out of bed. I went to her room and found her staring blankly at the walls. They seemed to breathe, swell, no, distort, whispering secrets in a language I didn't understand. "What's wrong, Emily?" I whispered, soothingly, but all I could manage was a stammer. She pointed to the window, lips quivering, and said, "Daddy, I don't like the closet anymore." The closet sat in darkness, ominous like a black mouth waiting to devour, and despite my instincts, I sat down next to her. After a few heart-wrenching moments, I dared to creep slowly towards the closet, swinging it open, only to find nothing, just clothes draping silently, shrouded like ghosts. I was about to close it when I noticed something unnatural, a reflection. For half a heartbeat, I thought I saw something flicker beyond the veil of silence, reaching for Emily's face, but then it vanished. I snapped it shut, and Emily cried. I wanted to gather her in my arms, to tell her it was going to be okay, but my voice cracked, fear clambering up my throat as I turned, surveying the room, convinced I had entered the realm of nightmares myself. For days, life twisted further out of alignment. The screams in the night returned, but now they spoke in strangled whispers, cryptic syllables turning my sweet girl into a captive of her own anguish. My resolve began to splinter when I suddenly understood that denying her aid would forever seal us in an embrace of despair, so in a fit of hopeless desperation that fateful Saturday morning, I relented, grabbed Emily, bundled her into the car, and we made that dreaded 20-minute drive to daycare, a measure of desperate hope dancing against the back of my mind. Yet, with my heart pounding, I saw that familiar chalkboard sign out front, announcing "We love our little ones." But beneath it was a smear of deep red. Instincts blared alarms, and the moment we stepped inside, the air turned tainted, tinged with despair that felt like an iron fist squeezing my lungs. The children were there, faces blank as if they were marionettes in a play where no one knew the lines. I turned to my sweet girl, gripping my palm around her little hand, and together we approached the woman at the front desk, a nurse with eyes too soft, a smile too wide. "Time to play, sweet pea." She chimed, but I saw through it. I wasn't ready to leave Emily there, and though she kicked and cried, begging, "Don't go, Daddy," the nurse gripped her too tightly, coaxing her with promises of fun. As I stumbled back to my car, a weight settled around my shoulders. What if I was never coming back? My trembling hands held the wheel like a lifeline, feeling the screams from the back of my mind pressing down, reverberating against each gut reaction, like echoes ringing through dimly lit corridors. For hours, I wrestled between sanity and dread, each ticking second morphing into hourglass grains of despair. Each minute felt unendurable, anxiety coiling tighter until my fear ignited like fire, and the need to go back became irrational, overwhelming. I darted back to daycare in a terrifying frenzy, my heart racing in erratic tempo, but the moment I returned, everything changed. Emily was nowhere in the chaotic, sterile playroom, and the nurse was gone without a trace. In a panic, I scoured every corner, digging through the laughter that taunted my railed senses, dread seeping thick and curling around me as I pushed through the door to the playground, only to witness Emily sitting on the ground alone, her bright blue eyes fixed on the sky, whispering almost urgently to something, or someone. "Emily!" I screamed, fear devolving into a chilling hollowness rapidly spreading through my body. It wrapped itself around my throat like a rope. Her eyes were wide, too wide, staring into the abyss, and no one in that bleak daycare seemed to care. They all continued on, as if puppets on a string, tied to an inaudible rhythm while Emily's soft voice spoke urgently to the shadowed form at the edge of the playground. My heart slammed in its cage as dread crumpled around me. I rushed towards her, snatched her up against me, and that's when the figures leapt from the shadows, the pure innocence of her childhood spilling into oblivion as if to taunt me with the impending doom. I shouted her name once more, and suddenly, I felt the world tilt, the realm twisting with each breath as black threads surged through the space. In that moment, I understood. AITA for not taking Emily to daycare? No, it was far more sinister than that, for not heeding the warnings whispered through her dreams and mine. I didn't expect my life to twist into this nightmare the day my husband brought his daughter from his first marriage to live with us. She was only 10, and he thought that having her here would help mend the fractured relationship they had, but, honestly, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Sure, I cared about her, she was a kid, after all, but I wasn't ready to be a parental figure, especially not so soon after we got married, and I made that clear to him, only for him to dismiss my discomfort with comments about being a real family. The first week was a whirlwind of chaos. She arrived with a duffel bag full of clothes but left the rest of her emotional baggage in her soul, the kind nobody else sees until it starts to weigh heavy in the air between us. Her name was Lily, and her big, doe-like eyes always seemed to hold memories of something dark, something unspoken. I sometimes caught her staring out of the window, as if waiting for someone or something that would never come, even as she wore a forced smile. The problem wasn't just her sadness, it was the creeping sense of menace that seemed to follow her, like something from a horror movie. There were strange occurrences, like objects moving on their own, or the times we'd hear soft sobbing at night, which would just be her mumbling in her sleep, but it made me feel paranoid every time I had to check on her. What made things worse was the way my husband looked at her, the way his eyes softened. It made me feel as if I was slowly exiting the picture, replaced by a ghost of his past. One night, while I was supposed to be preparing dinner, I heard her whispering to what I thought was an empty room, and when I walked in, she paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a dusty old book that had mysteriously appeared on the floor. I asked her about it, but her answer made my skin crawl. She said, "It's from my friend," which chilled me to the bone. I brushed it off, but the sense of dread grew with each strange event. The pictures on the wall started to tilt during the night, and whispers would echo in the hallways, trapped in the silence like trapped souls. I found myself constantly wondering if I was losing it, yet every time my husband and I fought, she'd seem to smirk as if she was the one pulling the strings in our marital discord. It escalated when I was packing for a weekend trip, and I found my necklaces strewn across the floor, hung like strange trophies on a noose made of what I could only assume was her sick humor. That night, I had a nightmare, a vision of a shadowy figure lurking behind her, its fingers stretched toward me. I jolted awake to find Lily standing at the end of my bed, her face illuminated by the moon. She simply smiled at me, tilting her head like a dog who hears a distant sound, which sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I screamed, waking my husband, who dismissed my fears as a mom's unfortunate imagination running wild, even when I showed him the book she claimed was from her friend. He read it and laughed, calling it a children's story, but the illustrations alone filled my stomach with dread. It was all about a little girl who made a pact with something ominous, something that came to collect its debts in twisted forms. I kept my confrontations about Lily's behaviors and the odd happenings to myself. After all, I was the one deemed the villain, labeled the stepmother who wouldn't embrace this child. The final straw came when Lily began talking about her friend more frequently. "He's coming to visit," she'd say with a serene smile, her eyes gleaming like the reflection of the moon in water. I thought I could reason with my husband, but he was too enthralled by her presence, a father blinded by the chance to rewrite their sad history. Then one evening, while I was in the kitchen, I overheard a snippet of their conversation. "She doesn't like you," is all I could catch, and then my husband's laughter, the sound grating against my instincts. I felt invisible, like a specter lingering in an abandoned house, and everything culminated when I returned home one day to find the house eerily silent. My husband was gone, and so was Lily. Panic gripped my chest like a vice as my calls echoed in the empty halls, the air thickened with uncertainty. Suddenly, the front door swung open. It was my husband, disheveled but alive, and behind him, with a faint glow, was Lily, holding a crude, dark drawing that depicted me, lifeless, under ominous clouds. My heart sank as I noticed her smile was replaced with a sinister, knowing grin as she said, "I told you he'd come back for you." That night, I sat trembling in bed, too terrified to sleep, the drawing propped open in full view, wishing with all my heart that this nightmare was just a figment of my overactive imagination. The atmosphere swirled with tension and malice, and each time I turned over in bed, it felt like eyes were watching me, waiting to collect something that had been promised long before I came into the picture. When dawn broke, the reality of my situation struck me, and for the first time, I wondered if I was making a mistake by refusing to take responsibility for the child who seemed to pull our family apart, knowing all too well that ghosts aren't always literal. Sometimes they are very, very real, and I had become the woman caught in the suffocating grip of a sinister pact, wondering if I, too, would be forgotten like the countless characters in the tales that had begun to seep into my mind, hoping desperately I wouldn't become a warning for someone else in the dark. It was just supposed to be a casual night in with my friends, sitting on the couch while we binge-watched old horror movies and made jokes about the cheesy effects, but everything shifted when Lynn, my closest friend, leaned in with a mischievous grin and said, "You know, watching you two is like watching a really intricate roleplay," and for a split second, I started laughing, not because I thought it was true, who would seriously think that? But more because the idea struck me as absurd, like something ripped from the pages of a bad fanfiction. My boyfriend, Jake, chuckled too, more out of awkwardness than agreement, but when I looked at Lynn, her expression changed from playful to something darker, almost predator-like, and in that moment, I felt a chill skitter down my spine. I shrugged it off, dismissing it as one of her quirky comments at first, but the laughter died in the air, replaced by a heavy silence. I didn't realize it then, but my laugh had unearthed something buried deep within the group, like invoking a slumbering spirit at a seance. The night progressed, filled with laughter over bad jump scares and popcorn fights, but every so often, I'd catch Lynn staring at me through the flickering light of the TV, her gaze intense, almost conspiratorial. As the clock struck midnight, the final film ended, leaving echoes of creepy music lingering in the air, and we all decided to call it a night. I started cleaning up the mess, tossing empty snack bags into the trash while Jake and Lynn chatted in the corner, and I could tell something was off. Lynn's smile had morphed into a smirk, and I felt that familiar unease prick at my skin, a sense I couldn't quite shake. Later, as Jake and I were getting ready for bed, I joked about Lynn's comment, playfully nudging him, "Maybe we should, spice things up a bit?" But he didn't laugh. Instead, he frowned, his brow furrowing. "What did you mean by that?" he asked, and I felt a rush of confusion. Wasn't we on the same page? I told him I was kidding, but then he shifted closer, scanning my face. "You didn't take her seriously, did you?" The weight of his gaze pierced through me, and a strange dread curled in the pit of my stomach as I denied it, even as I recalled the glint in Lynn's eyes. The next day, Lynn's texts were as animated as always, but beneath the surface, I could sense something off, like frayed wires on a live circuit. When I met up with her later, I tried to broach the subject lightly, but she dismissed my concern, her laughter ringing too loud, too haunting. The following months became a looping nightmare, where I'd catch Lynn watching me with an intensity that made my heart race, each encounter steeped in an unsettling tension I couldn't comprehend. I'd hear whispers behind my back, hushed tones between Jake and Lynn whenever I left the room, and Jake had begun to change too, his jovial demeanor shadowed by an underlying paranoia that echoed my own. Our intimate conversations grew strained, and he started to echo my own worries back at me. Was Lynn really just a friend, or had I become a pawn in their twisted game? The realization that Lynn had crossed a boundary I didn't fully grasp gripped me like a vice, and unease morphed into outright dread as I pieced together that her ramblings about roleplay might not have been innocent at all. One fateful night, driven by a mix of fear and determination, I decided I had to confront Lynn. I needed to know what was going on behind her mask of friendship. I invited her over, pretending to keep the atmosphere light, yet when she arrived, I could feel the storm brewing beneath our pleasantries, her laughter shrill and forced as I coiled my fists against my trembling legs. "What did you really mean when you said we were role-playing?" I pressed, and her expression flipped from playful to predatory, the corners of her mouth curling into that tight-lipped smile I'd come to dread. "Oh honey," she said, her voice sickly sweet, "you're the one playing a part, but the script was never given to you. You're just too naive to see it." My heart raced as I felt the air grow thick with something so palpable, it bordered on tangible. Every warning bell I had ignored screamed in my head, and I tried to excuse myself, to reclaim my sanity, but as I turned to the door, I could hear her murmuring my name, each syllable laced with something darker. The following week twisted into a surreal nightmare. I started to see shadows cast from my past interactions with both women seep through the cracks of my whitewashed reality, memories warped and rewritten. I catch Jake staring blanks at his phone, brow furrowed, whispers weaving like spider silk between Lynn's oddly timed texts and his own responses, and the intimacy we had shared dwindled to cold, vacant exchanges. I tried talking to him about it, about how Lynn was siphoning energy between us like we were puppets strung along by her whims, but each time, he'd grow defensive, lashing out as if my concerns were unfounded, and I found myself backed into a corner, racked with doubt, as if I was losing both my boyfriend and my own sense of reality. On a particularly agonizing night, exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed into a restless sleep, plagued by eerie dreams where I was an actor trapped in a puppet show, a caged bird pecked at by invisible threads pulling me into darker depths. I awoke with a start, and for a fleeting moment, the haze of the dream lingered, and I felt compelled to check my messages. The screen glowed eerie in the dark, and as I scrolled through the texts, dread coiled like a serpent around my heart when I discovered an unexpected text from Jake, "Meet me at the old playground," and the timestamp sent a shiver down my spine. It was sent during the night while I'd been dreaming. My heart pounded in my chest as questions overwhelmed me. Had they been plotting against me? What role had I been cast in? I grabbed my keys, driven by an impulse that propelled me forward, the shadows closing in like a muffled silence. The playground loomed in the distance, cloaked in darkness, and each step felt heavy, weighed down by foreboding whispers. As I arrived, the air turned thick and clammy, veiled in a chilling mist that whispered my name. "Jake." I called, but the night swallowed my voice whole. I turned, searching every silhouette under the moonlight, and then I saw her, Lynn, standing there, and in a heartbeat, I froze, terror gripping my throat as I felt an icy blast of realization. It wasn't Jake waiting for me, it was her, and the glint in her eyes confirmed the role I had unknowingly stepped into was far from innocent. "You finally made it," she said, her voice a twisted serenade that shattered my resolve. "I've been waiting for you." The darkness enveloped me, and I was left suspended in a nightmarish tableau, understanding too late that the laughter I once shared had been merely the haunting echo of a sinister game I never wished to play. I never thought I'd be that guy who gets grossed out by his girlfriend, but here I am, sitting in my dimly lit bedroom, heart racing and palms sweaty, wondering if I'm overreacting or if there's something genuinely disturbing about the situation. My girlfriend, Lisa, is the kind of woman who could light up a room with her laughter. She's bright, funny, and has this magnetic smile that drew me in the moment we met at that dive bar last summer. But lately, something else has been drawing my attention, and it's not as pleasant as her charm. It started small. She'd skip washing her hair for a day or two, saying she liked the natural oils or didn't want to ruin her waves, but after a few weeks, it became clear to me that this was more than just a beauty routine, it was an outright neglect. I hesitated, thinking maybe it was a phase or some personal statement she was making about embracing herself, but by week 3, I couldn't ignore the pungent odor that lingered in the air after she left the room. It was like the smell of damp earth mixed with something rancid, and I tried to brush it off as a trivial inconvenience. We'd hang out at my place, and out of desperation, I would spray air freshener when she wasn't looking, hoping she'd catch a whiff and feel compelled to wash up, but instead, she just kept piling on the dry shampoo, like it was some magical solution. One night, we were on the couch, cuddling while watching a movie, and I caught a whiff that made me gag, subtle but thick enough to linger, and I couldn't help but pull away. The look she gave me was one of confusion and hurt, as if I had slapped her across the face, and that was the moment I knew I had to say something. "Lisa, can we talk?" I started, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think you need to wash your hair more often." I braced myself for a fight, but instead of anger, she just laughed, that carefree laughter that had enchanted me so many times, now tinged with disbelief. "You're kidding, right? It's just hair. Who cares?" But I could see her self-assurance crack a little, the laughter not reaching her eyes. The days turned into weeks, each one more unbearable than the last. As we spent time together, her hair became a distressing presence. It was always stringy and looked like it was home to a family of grease rats. I felt disgusting just sitting next to her. Friends and family began to notice too, dropping pointed hints that couldn't go unaddressed. At dinner, my sister casually asked, "Are you okay, Lisa? You're not looking your best lately." I felt that crushing embarrassment swell in my chest, the ball of conflict growing larger every time I pulled Lisa close. One night after work, I walked into our apartment, fully ready to be hit by that noxious clout she now carried like a perfume, but what greeted me was oddly still. The whole place felt off balance, eerily quiet, and I immediately feared the worst. I wandered through the dim light, finding her bedroom door slightly ajar. I nudged it open, revealing the bed a mess of clothes and crumbs, but no Lisa. A sickening knot formed in my stomach as I turned to check the bathroom. The moment I stepped inside, reality twisted in a sickening way. The mirror was fogged up, and her hairbrush sat abandoned on the countertop, but where was she? The thought struck me like a lightning bolt that maybe she'd finally cracked. I found myself pacing the room, mind spiraling with worries, until I noticed the open window, and then I remembered something. She had mentioned a friend down the street hosting an art exhibit that night, so I grabbed my coat and rushed out, panic driving my feet. Arriving at the gallery, the vibrant colors painted walls contrasted sharply with the raw anxiety gnawing at my insides. I scanned the crowd, searching for her face, but found only strangers chatting and sipping wine. A wave of unease crashed over me. Where could she have gone? Just as I was about to text her, something deep within me prompted me to check the restroom. I pushed through the throng of bodies moving like a tide toward the bar, and as I reached the flickering light of the restroom sign, my breath caught in my throat. I could hear muffled laughter from inside, and I paused, my heart pounding. Forcing the door open, I stepped inside, and there she was, standing in front of the sink, her hair splayed out like a tangled mess, a friend from work, Jennifer, beside her. They both stopped laughing when they saw me, and the moment of silence hung heavy in the air, thick with all the things left unsaid. I stood frozen, my mouth working but unable to form words. "What's wrong, babe?" Lisa said, tugging a strand of greasy hair behind her ear, the innocence in her voice cutting deeper than any knife. My thoughts raced as I looked back and forth between the two of them. There was something unsettling about the way they were giggling, the way Lisa couldn't seem to feel the weight of the revolting crust forming on her scalp. Then Jennifer leaned closer and whispered something that sent chills racing down my spine. "It's only hair, right? It's like art, the messier, the better." Just like that, panic morphed into a visceral horror, and I stumbled backward, suddenly understanding that this wasn't a phase, this wasn't just about hygiene, but something far more sinister I hadn't grasped. An hour passed, and I was sitting outside, shivering not from the chill of the night, but the creeping realization that I couldn't be with someone who had willingly chosen to let themselves go so profoundly. I could hear the muffled noise behind me, laughter ringing out, but it all felt distant, strange. What kind of life did I want? Was I disgusted because I actually thought she was disgusting, or was my disgust a reflection of my own expectations of normalcy? When I went home that night, I tried to shake it off, but all I could think was that I felt trapped in a relationship that had dove deep into the abyss, her carefree attitude now looming over me like a shadow, leaving me pondering how far I would have to go to escape this tangled mess of love and revulsion. I texted her, "We need to talk," and waited, the screen flashing with those 3 little dots, and when she finally replied, it felt like the exhale I'd been holding for too long. "Can we talk about your hair?" I typed, my fingers trembling, but the response came quickly, and all at once. I wondered if it was really worth it to try and salvage what was left of us. AITA for being disgusted that my girlfriend doesn't wash her hair for weeks. The loneliness devoured me, as I realized I was getting sucked into the whirlpool of our differences, fighting with a growing sense of dread that maybe, just maybe, I'd be forced to choose between love and a life governed by a cleanliness I once took for granted. I never thought a simple conversation would spiral into a nightmare that would haunt me for years, but here we are. It all started on a Tuesday, a day no different from any other. I was sitting in my homeroom, surrounded by the hum of morning chatter, when Jacob, the class clown with a well-deserved reputation for chaos, turned to me with a smirk that made my stomach drop. Just moments before, I'd finally managed to brush off the whispers about my appearance. My thick glasses and untamed hair were like red flags to my peers, an invitation for their cruelty. But when Jacob said it, I felt the world around me fall away. He called me a slur I thought I'd never hear directed at me, a word loaded with hate and ignorance, so vile it caught in my throat like the last bite of a bad meal. I was frozen, my heart racing, knowing that confronting him would only lead to more taunts, but doing nothing felt like accepting defeat. After class, I couldn't shake off that moment, that bite of venom that whispered to me that I was less deserving of respect simply for being different. Against my better judgment, I decided to go to my guidance counselor, Mrs. Perkins, a woman known for her warm smile and the jam-packed schedule of students desperate to be heard. She was trusted by many, or so I thought. I walked in, rehearsing my words, ensuring that I could convey the hurt without sounding too weak. But as I recounted the story, I noticed her expression shift. It seemed like understanding morphed into disappointment. "You need to speak to him directly," she said, her voice steady yet devoid of compassion, and for a moment, I thought I was being brave, but a sense of dread settled in my chest. The next day, Jacob approached me with his usual swagger, but something was different. There was an intensity in his eyes, an expectation that coiled around us like a noose. I could feel the eyes of my classmates on us, holding their breath like they were waiting for a fight or, worse, a spectacle. Jacob leaned in closer, a sneer on his lips, and whispered, "You told on me, didn't you?" His voice dripped with malice, and in that moment, I realized I had walked into a trap of my own making. As I tried to find my voice, to say that I only wanted to be treated with a shred of dignity, he laughed, a cruel, guttural sound that echoed through the empty hallways, and my stomach twisted in a painful knot. The humiliation built with every laugh that chimed in around me. It was a familiar family of taunts, all mercilessly joining in, and I felt my standing as the target solidifying so solidly that it shook my core. I wanted to deny everything, to crawl into myself and disappear, but Jacob leaned in even closer, taunting me to deny it. I stumbled over my words, unable to fight back, and he responded by tossing out another slur, like throwing a stone into a glass house. His words shattered any belief I had in justice, and the following weeks turned into a blur of relentless bullying, an onslaught that transformed my once quiet school life into a daily battle of survival. The more I tried to advocate for myself, the worse it got. Whispers crept into the cafeteria, photoshopped images emerged on social media, and suddenly I was the joke of our school year. Each day, I pulled my hoodie tighter around me, a flimsy shield against the arrows of cruelty that seemed to fly directly in my direction. I lost friends, I lost joy, and I sat in silence while my name became synonymous with ridicule. I began dreading the walk through those school doors, feeling the heavy weight of shame, like a cloak that had been stitched together by every cruel word. It was as if every laugh in the hallway was a reminder that some stories have no heroes, only victims. I started seeing Mrs. Perkins less as an ally and more as a source of disappointment. Her suggestion echoed in my mind. Had I been weak by telling her? By doing something? I felt caught in a web of self-loathing and guilt, one that twisted itself tighter every time I was labeled as a tattle or, worse, a coward. My trust in adults wore thin, slipping through my fingers like sand as I realized this cacophony of cruelty felt tolerated. Days bled into weeks, each worse than the last, until one fateful afternoon when Jacob decided to take things further. During gym class, in a cruel stroke of fate, he managed to coordinate a moment that would forever mark my life. I was paired with him for a team exercise. The moment he stepped closer, I could smell the sweat mixed with arrogance, a vile combination that churned in my gut. "Are you going to run away like a little brat?" He sneered, pouring scorn into those words, and every ounce of my resolve melted away. Instead of freezing, instead of standing tall, anger surged through me, fueled by weeks of torment and shame. In a fit of rage, I swung my arm, a clumsy, desperate act born from pain, but it landed hard against his shoulder. The room silenced as if time itself had held its breath. I couldn't take my eyes off his shocked face, and for a fleeting moment, I felt powerful. But any sense of triumph was short-lived. Before I knew it, he retaliated with venomous fists, turning that forgotten gymnasium into a cage of chaos. I'd become the villain in my own story, surrounded by chaos, and the teachers pulled us apart, leaving us sitting in opposite corners of the principal's office as the narrative twisted. I was labeled the aggressor, the troublemaker, while Jacob donned his martyr's mask of innocence. Moments later, under the fluorescent lights that seemed to mock me, I finally spoke up, fearing for my future yet again. I recounted everything, how I had tried to stand up, how I had only wanted help, but in the eyes of the adults, I was merely misbehaving. "This isn't my fault," I cried, the desperation in my voice ringing hollow under their indifferent gazes. I became the conversation topic in whispers during lunch, and a target in the anxiety-ridden dreams that plagued me every night. My friends distanced themselves, afraid of catching what they labeled my drama. I lived in isolation, cocooned in a construct of my own guilt, paralyzed by the need for validation while crumbling beneath the weight of blame. The dreams turned darker, the whispers morphed into chants echoing in my head. I began to wonder if maybe I did belong in the shadows, if Jacob had been right all along. A year went by, each day a collection of silent scars grafted into my soul, and just when I began considering leaving school altogether, a weird email appeared in my inbox, one that made my breath hitch and my heart race. It contained a recorded conversation between Jacob and a mutual friend, a confession made in chuckles and arrogance, affirming that he orchestrated the entire thing with malicious intent, to bring me down, to revel in my despair. In a world that had painted me into a corner, I emerged, holding this tiny, clipped audio, a talisman of truth. Part of me wanted to send it off, share it with everyone who had ever judged me, but fear laced my hands. Who would believe me? I could feel the familiar voice in my head saying it was all just my fault for ever speaking to the counselor, that I had become nothing more than someone to be ridiculed. But I couldn't let Jacob's cruel laughter win. The next morning, I stood there, heart pounding, as I played the recording from Mrs. Perkins, tears of rage spilling over. She listened, the colors draining from her face, each slur echoing like a drum roll at a dark circus act. Days later, the principal called an emergency assembly, and for the first time in so long, the power had shifted. I stood in front of the student body, fog settling behind my eyes as I recounted the truth, knowing there may be repercussions but refusing to be the puppet in this horrid tale any longer. The gasps around the gymnasium filled the space like a chasm of realization, and the terrible weight of how I had felt for so long began to lift like a dawn breaking through a long night. Jacob faced the consequences. Suddenly, my once silent monster wore chains, and slowly the whispers turned into empathy. But still, as I left the auditorium that day, I could feel the air around me stifled with the remnants of hatred and, for the first time, a flicker of hope ignited. It wasn't an end, it was just the beginning of understanding that sometimes, telling the truth, no matter how painful, can set you free. Yet, no matter how much I felt liberated from the chains he had forged, I knew that I would carry the scars of that battle forever. So, I ask you, Ida, for telling the guidance counselor my classmate called me a slur? Because somewhere deep down, I am still that kid whose heart raced at the thought of being silenced, and to this day, that fear lingers, waiting for its moment to return. I'm writing this because I'm overwhelmed and terrified, and honestly, I don't know who to turn to because the whole thing feels surreal, like something out of a nightmare, and if I don't get it out there, I feel like I might explode. It started when I got engaged to my longtime boyfriend, Mike, and decided to have a small wedding in the woods near our favorite hike, nature-themed, simple, and intimate with just a handful of close friends and family for a lovely, rustic gathering. We were excited about everything, but when it came to the cake, we decided to go vegan since my best friend, Kylie, is vegan and had been there for me through thick and thin. We wanted everyone to enjoy it equally, without feeling pressured, and there's this small bakery that makes the most decadent vegan cakes, chocolate with raspberry filling, my absolute favorite. They assured me that the texture was just as rich as a traditional cake, and honestly, I was all in, so I ordered it and kept the choice a secret, wanting to surprise everyone. The day of the wedding arrived, and the air was crisp, filled with the sweet aroma of pine and flowers. The sound of laughter and soft music floated in the breeze as we exchanged our vows, surrounded by the natural beauty that had brought us together. The cake was everything I hoped it would be, a centerpiece topped with wildflowers, and everyone marveled at it when it was revealed, but as soon as someone took a bite, an odd heaviness fell over the gathering. The look on Uncle Barry's face was a mix of confusion and horror as he wiped remnants of cake from his mouth. A ripple of murmurs spread through the group, and before I knew it, Kylie was storming up to me with a scowl that could peel paint. Apparently, during her speech about happiness and acceptance, she inadvertently revealed the cake's vegan nature, which catapulted the guests into what felt like a modern-day witch trial. Barry, arms flailing, demanding to know why I had tricked him into eating something I hadn't labeled properly. It all spiraled out of control. Suddenly, guests were accusing me, some saying they felt disrespected by the deception, while others stood up for me, defending the choice and emphasizing taste over labels. I felt trapped in the eye of a storm, where accusations and judgments collided like thunder. I tried to explain my intentions, how I wanted to bring everyone together, but the more I spoke, the angrier they became, some claiming that it's unethical not to make dietary choices clear, which I didn't think was fair when at every event, there's bound to be someone who doesn't agree with the choices made. The tension was suffocating, and soon, guests began to leave one by one. I could see the disappointment written on my mother's face. She'd put everything into making this day special, but all I felt was shame invading my mind. I desperately sought out Mike, who was trying to calm Barry down in a corner, their voices rising with each heated word. Finally, unable to hold back anymore, I turned to Barry and said I was sorry but that he was being dramatic. That apparently triggered the lid off a boiling pot. Somehow, the conversation shifted, and not only was I under fire for the cake, but the whole wedding became a mess that solely fell on my shoulders, with even my mom chiming in with her disappointment. People began packing up the gifts, and I couldn't even process what was happening. Instead, I felt trapped in an absolute nightmare, and I began to weep while holding the remains of the cake, its beauty now marred by a strange mix of frosting and guilt. I lost track of time as people slipped away into the waning light, their murmured judgments still echoing in my head, and I could scarcely absorb the fact that my wedding day had transformed into a circus of accusations over a slice of cake. I caught snippets of conversations as the last of the guests trickled out, and someone even suggested that I should have known better than to force a cake with false marketing on them. I truly hadn't meant to upset anyone. How could a cake embody so much hostility? That night, Mike and I headed back home, his mood reflecting the dimness in my heart. He offered me a half-hearted consolation, mentioning how everyone was being overly dramatic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow ruined our biggest day over something that should have brought joy. Scrolling mindlessly through my phone later, I stumbled upon posts on social media clarifying their positions on veganism as if it were a debate about morality. It tore at my heart when I discovered pictures of my wedding cake, captioned with anger, disillusion, and disbelief from guests recounting the horror of being tricked. That night, I had dreams of each guest's scornful face as they took their first bite, transformed into grotesque figures, shouting that I had robbed them of their right to true desserts. I woke up drenched in sweat, barely able to stomach breakfast, each glance in the mirror reminding me of the shame that lingered so heavy on my conscience. It's been weeks since the wedding, and things slowly returned to normal, but I haven't spoken to Kylie since. She messaged me once to say she felt embarrassed, but I didn't respond, the disappointment in her voice too much for my heart to bear. From my peripheral, I've sensed Barry lurking online, recounting the wedding misstep in forums, initiating dialogues about what it means to purposefully hide vegan options, while I sit here haunted by memories of a beautiful day turned sour over a cake. I wondered if it was worth it to stand up for my decision or if they were right, and the guilt eats me alive. So, am I the asshole for refusing to label my wedding cake as vegan? I just wanted to create a joyful memory, and instead, it feels like I've broken an invisible contract of trust over something intended to be delicious and inclusive, and I can't shake the horrible feeling that whatever small sliver of pride I had in my choice has suddenly turned into something heavy, dark, and deeply harmful.